Hello and welcome to our post-Singapore pre-Japanese Grand Prix live stream. Thanks for joining us. If you are, it's a relatively difficult time right now. It's the best time for me, that's why I'm doing it, because we've got a lot of early mornings coming up, so I'm going to go to bed quite early. So doing a late evening live stream was never going to work this week anyway. So if you've joined me, thank you very much indeed. Maybe for some of you around the world, this is not a bad time slot, so that's good. On the other hand, if you're listening to this deferred, as they like to say, then thanks for joining me anyway. I hope you enjoy the show. It's 2 hours. I say the show, I mean, as that implies some sort of format, some sort of entertainment. Well, hopefully there's some entertainment, but it's just chat, really. I've got a few things that I want to mention proactively, but it's your show as much as mine. And so any questions you have, any comments you'd like to make, feel free. I'm sitting slightly off camera because the space to my left is for your questions to go up. It's a bit of a laborious process, as you've probably seen, those of you who watched the show before. So thanks for bearing with that. But yeah, got back from Singapore yesterday morning, actually now. It's quite a long trip from where I live in Spain. A long flight, of course, 12-hour flight, this time via Frankfurt, and then on to Madrid, and then train from Madrid. Had an interesting companion next to me, a guy sitting next to me on the flight out to Singapore. I think because we chatted about a lot of things that were not public knowledge as such, I shouldn't really refer to him by his company or his name or anything like that. Suffice to say, he does work for one of the big oil companies in Formula One. And we were just chatting away about, I mean, this whole world. It's just a completely extra world that none of us really talk about very much, and it's only one of many suppliers, of course, to the Formula One package, and the issues they have, not so much now, but certainly going forward in the 2026 regulations. And hope I'm not dropping anybody in it when I tell you that he astonished me by telling me that at the moment, and this is under the heading of everybody's trying to save money, cost cap, everything else, save the world. They've currently got over 100 engineers working on the 2026 oil and fuel regulations and building, making the right product within those regulations. He said it is unbelievably complicated, particularly the policing system that the FIA are going to use. Hate to think how much that costs, how much budget is going on that. And of course, that isn't just starting from scratch. That is also using knowledge gained in other forms of motorsport as well, which have their own budget, and that's obviously, you have to compute that as well into it, how much that's costing. If you're getting input from, I don't know what, touring cars, sports cars, whatever, that has to be amortized as well. So yeah, just amazing just to talk to this guy, very switched on guy, about just his world of oil and lubricants and fuel in Formula One. Really good. I mean, one thing that I'm sure you all know this, but I mean, it's worth reiterating that although you do see various fuel and oil brands on customer cars, generally speaking, they're all using the same fuel and oil as the parent company, parent engine company, which is pretty standard stuff. I mean, we've had that in Formula One for a long time, but worth reiterating, I think. So that was that. And yeah, lots of Formula One fans on the way. It's amazing how big Formula One is when you go to a race like Singapore, and it just takes over the whole city. You almost come away thinking, it's a bit too big. Do we really want Formula One to be this big? And you long for the days of a cluttered paddock at Clermont-Ferrand on the grass, and the mechanics standing around the Lotus 49s and the Yardley BRMs in the next transporter. And yeah, I mean, there's a certain simplicity to that. And I suppose in that context, I should mention something. It's left a bit of a weird feeling for me anyway, because it's kind of, I don't know, am I too old? Am I living in the wrong era now, or what? What am I doing wrong here? Because again, I'm not going to mention him by name because it wouldn't be fair. I'm sure it's not his fault. But there is a driver that I've been reasonably interested in watching, and because he's obviously had a lot of talent. He's racing currently in Formula Regional Europe, which is the equivalent of the old, I guess, Formula Renault, about Ford 2000, prior to Formula Renault. Just something above Ford 1600, really, or the junior Formula 4, I guess. And I put in an application to chat to him with a view to maybe just putting it out on the live stream to give him a bit of publicity and let the world know a little bit more about him from my particular viewpoint. And got in touch with the team that has the contract on him. And the reply came back, oh, he's much too busy. We want to limit the amount of time he's doing with the media at the moment. He needs to focus on other things. And I just thought, this is a guy in Formula Regional Europe, for Pete's sake. I mean, can you imagine Ayrton Senna in his Ford 2000 days, when he was reasonably well known within the Formula One paddock, but not that well known outside the sport. Indeed, his name, he was still known as Ayrton Senna da Silva then. Can you imagine him? Well, I can't anyway. I mean, you probably couldn't, because you probably went around then, but I can tell you now, if a journalist, regardless of who he was, daily paper, specialist, whatever, had gone up to Ayrton and said, Ayrton, when it suits you, can I do a quick interview with you, please? 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I mean, there's absolutely no way in the world Ayrton Senna would have said, no, I'm too busy, or go away, or whatever. He would have said, yeah, absolutely. As indeed would all normal racing drivers. I find it absolutely extraordinary now that guys in the categories as low as that are much too busy. They need to focus on their racing. I mean, surely, I was talking to Jackie Stewart about this in Singapore, and he said, actually dealing with journalists and knowing how to answer questions is part of getting on with your racing anyway. He couldn't believe it either. Anyway, I'm not going to drop any of them in it, because I like to think that the people involved are kind of friends, and I'm just, maybe that I'm missing something, but I'm not. I mean, that is exactly what happened. It's unbelievable. So on that subject, the Singapore was a reminder there's a lot going on. There's so many people everywhere. But Singapore's in a way quite a good race, because it's so hot and humid that a lot of people stay inside in the paddock area, that is. And then a few of them wander around. I mean, I took a picture of Fernando, walked in with Fernando to the track, and there he was watching the GT race from the outside of turn 3. And you can talk to a few of the drivers. I had a great chat great chat. It wasn't very long. I'm just walking along with Lando, and you probably know, those who are regular viewers of this, that I talk quite a lot about. I mean, it's one of the things that I'm interested in. Drivers that have absolutely naturally short corners, and they try to extend the straight into the corner and out of the corner. So they just have a very slow, relatively low rotation minimum speed, but they carry a lot of speed into that rotation point. And it's a question of absolutely minimizing the downside of the rotation point. That's where the talent comes. And it's also, and to have that talent, you need to supplement it with incredibly soft inputs and supple inputs, and so the car remains stable in a very unstable environment. And anyway, those who watch regularly would know that I've said many times now about Lando that A, he's a great racer, B, he's got great touch and feel, very, very light touch in everything he does. There's very little jolt in the way Lando drives. But he doesn't have the shortest corners in the world. And you can see that when he's out there racing against guys like Lewis and Max. You can see Lewis and Max just getting into a corner a little bit earlier and extending the straight a little bit more, and just having a little bit more comfort zone as they get the car set up with perfect braking a little bit earlier, but you could argue, but certainly carrying more speed up to a rotation point. Anyway, I was chatting to Lando, and just to get the conversation going, we had me with a laugh. I said, "Oh, Lando, I thought this is on race morning." I said, "I thought you'd be race afternoon. I thought you'd be on the pole. I was hoping you'd be on the pole yesterday." And he said, "Oh, no way we could beat the Mercs around here," as if they were on the pole. But anyway, they weren't. And I said, "Well, why is that? Why do you say that? You look pretty good. Lots of downforce, new upgrades on the car, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Oh, no, the Merc's got a much better front end than us. You can see it. You can see how late they can go into the corners." And I thought, this kind of proves everything I've been saying, because in Lando's world, how late you can go in is how good the car is. And I said, "Well, sure, you don't want to be doing that. Don't you want to be going early into the corners?" And he said, "Oh, well, yeah, you do. But if you go in early, but at least they can get to the apex sooner." I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. I thought it was quite funny, because to me that was a little bit of a mix-up of him. I'm not going to say that's the wrong. I was going to say him confusing it, but in his world, he obviously thinks he turns in at exactly the right place. And when he sees George, I guess, who's also turning in quite late, he thinks, wow, George can get away with that. And I suppose in that respect, the Mercedes does have a slightly different, maybe a slightly better front end. I don't know, hard to believe. But But what he's not done is thought about, oh, maybe I could go in the corner earlier, and maybe then I wouldn't be so reliant on the front end being brilliant. And that, it's quite, I mean, put Lando to one side, I thought it's quite interesting that obviously the engineers have never said that to him, because that would actually be worth trying. I'm not saying it would be a perfect solution, but there's a good example of where Lando actually could probably pick up a little bit of consistent speed improvement. I'm not talking about just dramatically in one corner or even in one weekend. I'm just saying over a season he could probably pick up 0.1 of a lap of consistency if he was going into the corners a little bit earlier. And if the McLaren doesn't have quite as good a front end as the Merc, doesn't matter. You know, get away with it by just manipulating the car more. So that was quite interesting, I thought. And then, you know, I did mention in the video on Sunday night that I had a good chat with Adrian, actually. It was very relaxed. I mean, if the Red Bull has been completely and utterly annihilated now by the new technical directives and several technical directives we've had recently, then Adrian was very laid back. I mean, maybe he's just looking forward to his holiday in Cape Town at the end of the year and fishing or going on a boat or whatever he's going to do, or racing his Lotus 49B. But he was very relaxed, and it's quite difficult when it's such an obvious question to get the question out with Adrian, because he can look a little bit overpowering sometimes. So I just said, you know, Adrian, are you concerned at all? I mean, is there any, what do you think about this TD and where you're at? And as I said, and he looked at me as if, what are you talking about? I said, well, I'm assuming that some people think there's a relationship between this technical directive being enforced for Singapore, because the FIA made a big thing about it was going to be enforced for Singapore. Flexi wings, no longer. And Red Bull falling off the pace. And he said, no, it's nothing to do with that. I mean, and I, you know, it's what I said on, I think on the Friday video, or maybe the Saturday video, that, you know, it would be astonishing if something like a 2mm flexibility margin had suddenly been eliminated and the car went from the front of the grid to the midfield. I mean, it's almost beyond belief. And of course that's the look I got from Adrian as well, which bears out what I was saying. You know, let's at least see how the Red Bull goes at Singapore before anybody jumps on the bandwagon there and says, you know, these two events must be related: the technical directive and then the Red Bull being in trouble. So then I just said, so it's a bit like Brazil last year. Yeah, obviously ride height thing, and then beyond that it was, you know, this weird thing with the seamless shift, where Max was complaining about it for much longer and for much more than he'd ever complained about it all year. But I did make the point to Adrian that it's not the first time we've heard Max on the radio talking about the shift, and more than most drivers in most teams. And he said, yeah, that's right. I mean, here he said, you know, I said he talked about the humidity of Singapore not being helpful, and I said, you know, any technophobes out there, to give me your input on that. I've been thinking about that, and I you know, having worked with Adrian a bit at Williams with the 14, one thing I can tell you, and I bet it's no different, is that Adrian's concept of packaging is still completely different to everybody else's concept of packaging. Everything is down to the, well, John Barnard would be the other one, but he's no longer in business, down to the absolute millimetre of clearance. And if there's a packaging around the software, it's for the shift, then you can be sure, I would say, that it's more tightly packaged and therefore possibly more difficult to cool on the Red Bull than any other car. I would suggest that's probably pretty much the case. But having said all of that, they did get it right in the race. Was it cooler in the race? It probably was as the race went on, and it didn't appear as if Max had any shift problems in the race. Indeed, on the contrary, his preview to this Japanese Grand Prix this weekend begins with Max saying, we want to continue the momentum we had in the race in Singapore. In other words, the car was great in Singapore in the race, let's keep it going in Japan. Which is a bit of a shock, I think, for everybody that's going on about how they've been hurt by all the technical rule changes. So, and that's how I saw that race. I think, you know, I did say in the Sunday video, if you'd just landed from the planet Mars and dropped to Earth and saw how quickly Max was able to drive and what he was doing in that race, whether he was on new mediums or hards or whatever, you would have thought, yeah, that guy's quick. If he's in midfield, it must be because they had some drama in qualifying, which is now not there. So the car did look good in the race, I thought. I didn't make in my video on Sunday night so much to think about, and it didn't get this point across, was a point that Max confirmed, which was they were unlucky with the safety car, by which he's saying, of course, I think he meant the virtual safety car, and it came out 2 laps after he stopped for tyres. I know I did make that point, didn't I? I said I didn't think it would make that much difference. And I was having breakfast with a mate, Matthew Marsh, actually, on the Monday after the race, and I was going on about how, as I did in the video, great call by Ferrari. Well, great call in retrospect by Ferrari, but very edgy, because if they'd lost that race on the last lap or last 2 laps, imagine what would have happened in Italy and all the talk about strategy. And it was that close. And I was saying, really good call by Mercedes to bring them both in. And he said, oh, well, they didn't have much choice, did they? That's of course what they can do. He said the big mess was why they didn't bring Leclerc in. And I didn't really think about that at the time. I suppose you could argue from Leclerc's point of view, had they brought him in and put him on new medium, not a lot to lose, let's see what happens. He could have had he could have put a lot of pressure on, I don't know, he might have got past Lando, who knows. But it never occurred to me to talk about that, because for me, Ferrari made the right decision early in the race to tell Leclerc to get away from Sainz, to drop back to 3 seconds, and to let Carlos focus on his race. And it never occurred to me that they would have thought about bringing him in for mediums at the end, because they'd already made the decision that this was a race they wanted Carlos to win, and wanted to minimize the amount of pressure and aggravation he was getting from anywhere, let alone from the teammate. So I would, it never occurred to me to even mention it, because for sure Ferrari, if they did think about it, would have thought, no, the last thing we need is Charles Leclerc on new mediums, catching Carlos at 2 seconds a lap with 5 laps to go and 10 laps in the game, putting massive pressure on Carlos and maybe forcing him into a mistake. We don't need that. So that's why I think they didn't do that, and that's why it never occurred to me to even mention it, because to me that was not on the table, and I think they made that clear with their decision early in the race to let Carlos have free air and not be under pressure from Charles, all of which I think was totally correct, and they handled that really well. So, yeah. The other thing, of course, is George and that mistake, which I think is pretty characteristic of, well, I think it's a litmus test of George's character and Lewis's character. And although it's difficult to say this definitively, but let's say that you did want to feel that right now George, not right now, forevermore probably, George is the faster driver, and Lewis has maybe lost a little bit in qualifying, and George is always, assuming he's happy with the car, is always going to be a little bit quicker. Of course, the downside to that, from George's point of view, is what Lewis can then do in the race. And we saw that, and we saw how well Lewis could think of the last 5 laps on the first lap out on those new mediums. And he's been around long enough to know when to push and when to shove, and when to just let the tire cycle work. And there's George pushing like crazy, going as quickly as he possibly could. And there's Lewis kind of, drifting around a little bit in his slipstream, but with the tyres in great shape with the last 3 laps of the race. And George's tyres obviously going off, running very hot, and it was one of the reasons he had the shunt. He's right on the edge. And I've said several times, the thing about George, several times on videos, on other live streams, the thing about George, and I've compared him with Jochen Rindt, that is the only way he can race and drive. He's absolutely on the edge, and he does have slightly longer corners than Lewis, and everything is slightly spikier. And what we saw was exactly the manifestation of all of those. Slight mistake, but it wasn't so much as a positioning of the car. It was the way he loaded the car and the way it hit the curb on entry that caused the thing to get out of control. It wasn't, he'd taken his eye off the ball and just moved gradually. It was just bang, it was one of those. A bit like the Lance Stroll thing. And, that is George's weak point. And it's not the first time he's had that sort of shunt. So, there's Lewis watching that. Sir Lewis Hamilton, 7 times world champion. Worth underlining that point, because quite often when George beats him, I think there's a massive amount of George, and a lot of people are starting to either forget about Lewis or take him for granted. And I think he did a really good job in that race. Okay, he only got 3rd, didn't beat Lando, but if George, as I said in the video, it's a big if, and of course it's a hypothetical thing, but if George hadn't been around, or George had been behind Lewis for sure would have got past Lando, I think, and he might have put serious pressure on Carlos in a lap or two, because I think he would have had his tyres in better shape in the last 3 laps. That's why I think that. So yeah. Anyway, let's go to some of the questions which are piling in. I hope I can get through them all. I think we got quite a lot already. And thanks again for anyone joining at this. It's midday here in Spain. But where you are in the world, I hope it's not too inconvenient a time. So, first question. These are from people who have lined up, as it were, early to get the question in before we went live. So I'm just sort of starting in chronological order. I'm just putting this now into the right sort of thing. I said it was a bit of a laborious process, but there you go. Aaron Lee, do drivers differ much in their ability to deal with elevation changes? Were there any who stood out in this respect? It's a good question, but it's not something that I've thought much about, and I don't think many other people have either. When you mention elevation changes, I think of corners like Westfield and Dingle Dell at Brands Hatch, or obviously the Nürburgring, the old Nürburgring, Spa, Eau Rouge. My experience, Grand Prix drivers look so far ahead that the actual elevation between where they are and where they're going to end up is kind of unimportant, if you like. The only thing they're looking at is what angle and load is going to be on the car when they get to that point. That's quite a difficult thing to do. That was quite a difficult thing to do at the Nürburgring when you're getting airborne. But even then, all they're doing is looking a long, long way ahead. And although you often see photographs of cars at an angle, and you think, wow, what happened when that car landed? In reality, the driver's looking at that point, and already he's balancing the car in the air, if you like. The other thing about that, just taking off, was very important to take off with the right attitude on the car as well. So in reality, you always wanted to try and take off with the nose in the air, so you'd come down on the back first. But that wasn't always possible if it was flat out. So, and the Nürburgring was very difficult for that. No, I don't think that's a huge part of it, that whole business of elevation changes and how drivers perform there. I think it's more of an issue for engines and gearboxes and ride heights and all that stuff. That's much more of a problem. But thanks for that question. Oh, and Aaron, same question, has got another question, which we'll do. I don't suspect we're going to have as many questions as we normally do because of the time we're in at the moment, which is, for those that are there, I think it's going to be good news, because I think I might be able to get through all the questions for a change, which would be good. Let's have a look. I've got a few other things I want to talk about as well, so at some point I'll do that. Aaron Lee again. Another question. Is the suppleness of inputs observable from onboard shots of the steering wheel? I've been trying to take notice, but I'm not sure if it's something that's too subtle to be seen on TV. Yeah, in my experience it is. I think what you can see on the onboards is excess steering wheel movement, which not too many Formula One drivers have, but quite a lot of drivers in Formula 3, Formula 2 have it. You see, it's this sort of boom, 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 I'm getting ready for the moment, and they're just moving the wheel slightly. You can see that, and that is not good, obviously. In terms of suppleness, the difference between, say, Carlos Sainz and that's not a good example, because Carlos is beautifully supple in the way he's driving at the moment, in this lovely zone in which he's found himself. But if you look at George, for example, compared with Lewis, it's very difficult to see any difference between them from the onboard shot and the steering wheel inputs they're giving the car. very difficult. You've got to relate that. You've got to be able to relate that to load and also to the footwork that's going on at the time, whether both on the brakes and the throttle, coming out of the brakes, perhaps loading the throttle as he's coming out of the brakes, and also, of course, where the car is on the road in terms of load. Whether or not all four wheels are flat on the road, whether you've got load and you're trying to brake, all sorts of things that can't be seen on an onboard camera come into play when we talk about suppleness and just being at one with the car. Very, very difficult to see that on the onboard, I'm afraid, which is why I often, I just wish we had really good footwell cameras. The problem there is the space you'd need for the light to make it really work, and then of course it needs to be perfectly related to the steering wheel inputs as well. So seeing the throttle going down but not knowing what he's actually doing with the steering at that point wouldn't be very helpful. You've got to be able to see everything coordinated. So it is very difficult. And you say, oh, well, that's computer games. Well, it is kind of, except that you need also really in a perfect world to feel the load and know where the load of the car is. So you'd probably need to have a friction circle or traction ellipse graphic there as well going on. And then you've got so much going on, it'd be very difficult to take it all in a half a second, if you see what I mean, which is why I say you miss, it's all happening in half a second or so and less, and all that difference is all tied up in that tiny time frame. So yeah, let's have a look at this one. This is from Gandalf the Fool. We have you quite often as well, Gandalf, I think, so thank you for that. Let me just have a look. So, Gandalf the Fool, hi Peter, hope you're doing great. I am, thank you very much. Bit jaded probably after all that travel, but in the gym this morning and everything kind of okay. Do you see a similarity between Charles' situation this year and Kimi's in 2008? Charles has been complaining about understeer all season, just like Kimi in 2008. No, not really. I'm not aware that Charles has been complaining of understeer all year. I mean, I know the Charles guys pretty well, and the car hasn't been particularly good until the last two races, kind of. But it hasn't just been, understeer. It's lots of things. It's, no grip, all this, that, instability. I mean, when you think about those two... Dexter, hello. What are you doing? Sit down there. When you think about those two incidents he had in Miami, same corner, 2 consecutive days, that wasn't understeer. That was just absolutely on the edge, giving it everything he could on change of direction. So, yeah. And I don't really see much difference between the two because Kimi was so laid back about the politics. It was just like, well, if I'm here, this is what I want to do and I'll get on with it. Thank you very much. Whereas Charles is, very articulate and he's very motivated and he's quite emotional. More so, I mean, if you look at them at the moment, you'd have to say that it looks as if Charles got the sort of volatile Latin temperament and Carlos Sainz has got the very laid-back Nordic approach to life. I mean, that's how they appear, isn't it? It's amazing the transformation between those two in the space of the last 18 months. Charles is a pretty emotional guy. And in my opinion, it's getting between him and his ability to do what he can do so well. And I think he is still the quicker driver. But right now, Charles is in trouble because he's making quite a lot of mistakes. And if things aren't quite right, he's coping with it less efficiently politically than Carlos Sainz. Carlos, meanwhile, is just doing what he does very well, found that rhythm, doesn't do much, doesn't say much, just stays quiet. And yeah, I wonder whether, I did that tweet about his dad and same weekend he was over there in Sardinia winning that Extreme E race with his team. And his dad is such a cool guy. I knew him quite well when Carlos was driving for Toro Rosso. and we'd sort of make a point of meeting in the Toro Rosso thing and watch the start together and do these things. And he's just not a normal racing dad, as you would expect. He's just very, very calm and totally aware of everything that's going on, and doesn't say much, doesn't get wound up like a lot of racing dads. And I think that is a great thing for Carlos. The more I think about it, the more I think that whole family regime has been really good for him. And I think that's why he's still close to the family, and as far as I know, still hangs out in Madrid when he can, because that's so important to him. Whereas Charles, I think, has a lot of hype around him all the time. Different sort of guy. Very different from Kimi, and I don't think the understeer thing was a common factor either. But thanks for the question. Okay, you're all asking. Oh, this Gandalf's actually asking 3 questions, but no problem. We'll get on with the next one. What is that? What's this one all about? As I say, I don't actually read these questions before they come through. One day it's going to catch me out, probably. But anyway, not when it's friends like this that I know the names of, who are regular viewers, which is great. Quite a lot of people in Singapore came up and said, "Oh, I love the YouTube channel, Peter." Yeah, amazing. Gamble. So I know we've talked about short corners a lot. Would you agree the essence of short corner is to get as much rotation as possible under braking to minimize the pain of mid-corner rotation? No, I think there is only one. And in my mind, there's only one rotation point. And all a driver is doing, if he's trying to shorten the corner, is to lengthen the straight before he has to really prepare the car for that very slow rotation point. What he wants is to extend the straight into the corner and to extend the straight out of the corner. So he wants to get the car straight and keep it straight. He wants to keep it straight for as long as possible, or slightly angled, and then he wants to get it straight as soon as possible. But he knows that somewhere along the line he's got to rotate the car. And because he's putting so much emphasis on extending the straights, the rotation point is the thing that suffers. And that is the thing that happens at a very low, relatively low minimum speed. Whereas I think a longer corner driver is always looking for, naturally, he's got a feel for a high minimum speed. That's very important to him, getting on the power as soon as possible, even if he's still got load on the car. But it means that what he's doing into the corner is a bit compromised by braking in a straight line and then having to turn the car. And that's opens him up to error and loads the tires more, uses the tires more, not necessarily overused, but uses the tires more, and doesn't necessarily allow him to get the car straight as soon as he wants to. So they're the 2 differences. And I would say Max and Lewis are classic examples of short corner drivers. And Carlos Sainz is a classic example of a long corner driver who does it really well. A bit like, Ayrton Senna was a longish corner driver. He certainly wasn't a short corner driver in the way Alain Prost was. And Ayrton didn't make a lot of mistakes. He made some, but not usually under braking, locking up. It was more, I'm going to try and take this corner flat. Oops, it's not flat. That sort of thing. So to me, the real talent of a short corner driver is not that he has a feel for the moment where he can start turning the steering wheel. It's partly his softness and suppleness and the lack of any sort of spikiness in any of his movements with the hand and the feet, keeping the car absolutely as stable as possible. But absolutely critically, and I think this is the most important thing of all, it's an innate feel for when to rotate the car, for what is the moment on the corner with the least possible downsides when he's got to do this really annoying thing of just turning the car, the substance of the corner, the rotation point. And that is something that changes, as I've said before, changes every corner, every lap, due to fuel load, tire wear, temperatures, ambient temperatures, brakes, how you brake, how you come out of the brake, all the factors that the driver's trying to control. And I've compared it before with juggling balls on a billiard table. If you're trying to keep them all in the center, not hitting the edge, but they're all moving, the movements you would need in order to be able to do that. Very similar thing. And it's knowing when to rotate the car. That is the absolute epitome of the talent. And it's an innate thing, in my view, that. Of course, more and more experience will help a driver, but it's nonetheless, ultimately, it's an innate thing. And early in his career, before he went to Ferrari, Kimi was very good at that as well. And I'm not sure what I've just described is something that's ever spoken about in team meeting rooms, or a driver talking to an engineer on a Tuesday or a Wednesday after the race when they're in the sim. I don't think they talk about that specific detail. And as you know, as my conversation with Lando, which I mentioned at the beginning of this live stream, I don't think Lando is aware that he turns in a bit later than, say, Lewis. I still don't think he's aware of that. And even if he is aware of it, I'm not sure he thinks that it's him. He probably thinks, oh, that's the way the Mercedes likes to be driven, and I drive the way the McLaren likes to be driven, if you see what I mean. Because it's not something that drivers think about very much. Why that is, I've no idea. But, if they all began their racing careers by compulsory reading of Jim Clark at the Wheel, the book that Jim published in '64, then they probably would have a feel for it. Because Jimmy said then, I have an early false apex, unlike many drivers. He didn't really explain it, didn't explain the advantages of that, but at least he identified that he did it. And, if you're any racing driver with a brain, you'd read that and you'd think, wow, well, that's interesting. What does that mean exactly? And then you'd ask a few questions and think about it. But they don't really. And I think the engineers today and the way you approach racing is so data driven that it's a given that there is a correct way of driving around the corner. And that's why you often have engineers, there's only one correct way, sorry, let me rephrase that. That's why you hear engineers saying, oh, get on the power bit sooner in turn 7, you're losing time here. They're just looking at traces of the two drivers and seeing where one of them's got on the throttle a little bit earlier. And they just assume that's got to be better. But if you looked at the throttle traces of Lewis and George, you would see very different throttle applications. And sometimes getting on the power later is better if you're spending that time just manipulating the car to be absolutely straight on exit. And indeed, you've gained a lot of time into the corner because you're just slightly turning the steering while the other guy's sort of still braking in a straight line up to a turn-in point. And you're doing a lot better job for the tires over a longer period of time. So it's very complicated, and I hope I haven't lost anybody with all of that. But, the more questions that come, the more we'll sort of get the layers off it. But to me, final answer to your question, you could argue the minute you start turning the wheel is the beginning of a rotation. But in my mind, when I talk about rotation, I'm talking about this moment of the least possible downside actually to get the car turned. And that moment, they're not interested in the minimum speed. The only thing they're interested in is just getting the rotation perfect. And as I said several times, Max is really good at getting the right amount of steering lock on the car mid-corner to give him a dead straight exit, to get the power on really, really well. Whereas Perez, who doesn't have short corners, has to juggle the variables in other ways, but he's also really good. I mean, if Perez could actually drive into corners the way Max does, he'd probably be better than Max out of them because he's so good on traction. But he doesn't have the car in the right position very often. He needs 90-degree corners. And it's a shame from Perez's point of view that the Red Bull was not very good at Singapore, because it is a circuit where he could go quite well, or should go quite well, and does go quite well historically. Gandalf says, thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day, Peter. Thank you very much. So another question from Bailey. This one now. Not Julian Bailey, I think. Very quick driver, Julian Bailey. I really rated him in Ford 2000. And he did a pretty good job in Formula One alongside Mika Häkkinen, actually, or Johnny Herbert, one of them. He looked pretty good. Not very long at Lotus, but I thought he was a talented driver. Bailey, hi Peter, what do you think is the greatest qualifying lap of all time? Woof. And who are some of the quickest drivers over a single lap in history? Well, problem with these questions is that whatever I say, I'll always think of somebody half an hour after we've finished the live stream, and I think, oh, I never mentioned them. So, very difficult to answer that. I mean, there's so many. You can't pick any. I mean, I think Jim Clark's... Peter Windsor talking about Jim Clark. Can it be so? I think Jim Clark's pole at Spa in '67 was pretty impressive. Let's have a look what the margin was. And then I think Nigel Mansell's pole... No, sorry, not his pole, but his qualifying lap for Ferrari at Silverstone in 1990. I think he was 2 seconds quicker than Prost. That was pretty impressive. I don't think it was the pole though, was it? 67 Belgian Grand Prix. What was Jimmy's? And this is in a Lotus 49 with no wings on it, right? No seat belts, no wings. Let's put it into perspective. And this is a 3-litre Cosworth DFV. Trees both sides. Spooky circuit. Let's have a look at the... not sure it's going to give the qualifying time on this. It's a bit of an annoying thing. He definitely... Oh, yeah, here it is. Yeah, Jim Clark. 3 minutes 28.1 for the pole. P2, Dan Gurney, Eagle. 3:31.2. So it's a long lap, I'll give you that. But he's 3 seconds quicker than Dan Gurney in the Lotus 49. Graham Hill P3 in the other Lotus 49. And when you think of what Jimmy had to do around Spa to get that Lotus 49 really on the limit, that's as good a qualifying lap as you're going to get anywhere, I think. So there's that one dealt with. I think Nigel's pole lap at 92 then, if you want to put another pole at Nigel's pole lap 92 British Grand Prix was pretty good, wasn't it? And the 14B. Yeah, it was a great car, but nobody could have got more out of that car than Nigel Mansell that day. And I think Carlos Reutemann's pole, Monaco 78, was as good as they come as well. And who are some of the quickest drivers over a single lap in history? Well, Carlos Reutemann, Nigel Mansell, Ayrton Senna, Jim Clark, Sterling Moss, Jochen Rindt. In recent times, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher. I think James Hunt was a very good qualifier over one lap. He really, really became super quick over one lap. And yeah, he very good race management as well, but he was very good in one lap. Keke Rosberg also extremely good over one lap. You know, literally cigarette out, throw it on the ground, stamp it out with a foot, climb into the car, let's do it. It was that sort of thing. There's so many. I mean, I'm going to Nuvolari for sure over one lap, I would say. Let's go. I mean, Fangio. Yeah, absolutely. Fangio. Why wouldn't you include Fangio in that? Of course you would. Alberto Ascari, obviously. So there's so many. You can't do it. I wouldn't include Fernando Alonso. There you go. There's a guy I wouldn't include because I think he just doesn't. A bit like Jean Berra, I think he just loves racing. It's the opposite, flip side to Carlos Reutemann, if you like. And you know, Fernando, quite often you see him racing much better than he qualifies. Okay, didn't happen in Singapore. What did happen in Singapore for Fernando Alonso? What was Aston Martin doing? I mean, at one point he said the car is completely undrivable, and for Fernando Alonso to say that, A, and it must be completely undrivable, and B, normally, I mean, I'm trying to think the last time I heard that phrase actually from anyone. Niki Lauda, 77 Swedish Grand Prix in the Ferrari T2. But then they were on Goodyears that were very stiff sidewalls with a very flexible chassis. The whole thing was a nightmare. Gilles couldn't believe how bad the car was. And Niki just walked out of the car and walked away in the Swedish Grand Prix. But that was at a time when there was an obvious difference in the tyres that were hurting Ferrari. But you can't say that here, really. I mean, the Pirellis have been around for a long time, and we've seen Aston Martin go very well on these Pirellis in general. So, I don't know. I mean, how can... Just on that, though, it's another point, actually. I was talking to somebody at the Aston Martin team before the race, and I said something like, what do you think about the effect of the technical directive and Red Bull's pace? And they said, oh, no, it wouldn't be that. It was, for sure they've just got it wrong, which is what most people seem to be saying. and what I believe to be the case. And then I said, but in your case, I'm reading that a lot of people have said that Aston Martin have been hit by a previous technical directive that actually affected the flexibility of the wings prior to Singapore. And he said, well, that's complete and utter garbage. And I said, is it? I mean, I haven't really taken much interest or focus on it. And yet a lot of people are saying that. They're using that as an example of how it's affecting Red Bull now. They're saying, well, it's obviously hurt Aston Martin. And he looked at me and said, well, if people regurgitate enough rubbish, it's going to turn into worse rubbish, isn't it? And that's what goes on with the internet all the time. All these people come out with these things that Aston Martin has been hit by having to run stiffer wings. He said it's complete and utter rubbish, or indeed any other part of the car, not just wings. So, my eye is not good enough, I have to confess, to see the difference in flexibility down to the margin of about 2 millimeters. So I can't say any more than what I'm reporting from my conversations, and that's kind of how I saw it as well. I always imagined, just looking at what was going on, that Aston Martin made some real progress with upgrades and then went backwards a little bit with upgrades, or perhaps didn't move forward enough, and they've kind of got a little bit out of sync. Andy Green off the program now, a whole new aero team taking over, and things aren't perhaps going quite as well as they should initially, and all the new factory and everything else, big issues. But I never thought, wow, they've obviously been hurt by some technical directive that hasn't hurt anybody else. And pretty much that was proved to be the case. So I think we all have to be quite careful about when things appear online, enough people repeat it to the point where it suddenly appears to be fact. But everybody, we know that, don't we? I mean, that was always the case. It's just that it's propagated more because it's much easier to do it online. I mean, we need to be careful of how much of that actually happens. Got a nice coloured question here. Thank you very much. I've got two. This one, Ashar. Why? That's an interesting question. I presume Ashar's a bit of a Daniel Ricciardo fan, I would imagine. I mean, if you're Daniel Ricciardo right now, you're feeling a bit nervous, aren't you? Because Liam, as predicted, and he's doing such a good job, Red Bull aren't going to want to see him sitting around in the garage doing nothing for too long if Daniel comes back, are they? Why didn't Ferrari opt to sign Ricciardo for 21 when he was more in demand than Carlos in 20? I've not seen an answer from any content creator. Thanks. When you say more in demand, I can't imagine there was ever a moment when Ferrari wanted Daniel Ricciardo more than they wanted Carlos Sainz. I think they wanted Carlos Sainz from the moment he was obviously going to be pretty good. He's exactly the sort of Ferrari driver you want. And I think the way Daniel left Red Bull left quite a lot of questions in people's minds, because it looked like he was not prepared to race alongside Max Verstappen because he was afraid of getting beaten. That's what it looked like, and he went to Renault where the big money was. So it wasn't really a I can't imagine Ferrari were thinking, well, you want Ricciardo more than we want Carlos Sainz. Carlos Sainz at the beginning of his career, a driver they could mould, very much in the Ferrari idiom, and for sure the old Carlos Sainz Sr. was pushing quite hard as well. For me, Daniel was a driver at that point where most Formula One people thought, wow, this guy's leaving Red Bull when they're winning races. What's going on mentally? Is he motivated to do that? I mean, that was the issue, I think, and I think a lot of people thought at the time, this is a bad move. Why is he doing that? But I hope that answers your question. It probably doesn't, because it looks like as if you think Daniel is, you're a massive Daniel fan, which is fine, no problem with that. But I'm not really helping you there because for me, right now, as I say, to me, Liam Lawson is doing at least as good a job as Daniel Ricciardo in that AlphaTauri. And I spoke to a couple of people about this, and my opinion was that I'm not sure Daniel would have bumped Max into P11 at the end of Q2, whereas Liam did. He may well have done, and I may be doing Daniel an injustice, in which case I'm doing him injustice, which is sad. But in my opinion, right now, Liam Lawson is probably a quicker driver than Daniel Ricciardo. It's just my opinion. I mean, Daniel, we haven't seen enough of him back in business again. And as I said, when he did get that drive again with AlphaTauri, it could be that he's kind of got everything out of his system now. All that stuff of leaving Red Bull at the wrong moment, going for the big money, driving for teams that weren't really going to reward his talent, and then going to bed at night knowing he could still be in a Red Bull and isn't, and then getting his chance again. It may well be that he is the old Daniel Ricciardo, but he's going to have to be super quick to be quicker than Liam Lawson, I think. Liam Lawson is seriously impressive driver. That's my opinion. Luka Mikic, another coloured question. Thank you very much for the donation. That's very kind. Let me see what this one is. Greetings, Peter. I've never fully grasped what is meant by car balance. Can you explore it a little bit? Thank you. You have unparalleled philosophy. Oh, thank you very much. It's a good question because it's balance is talked about a lot, isn't it? And one of the previous questions talked about Kimi and understeer. The balance of the car it's a personal thing, because some drivers may say, I want the car to be completely neutral. I don't want the front sliding any more than the rear. I want to know that the car has got exactly the right amount of movement on the front and rear axle. Others may say I can deal with a little bit of understeer, which means when I turn the steering, the front slides a bit, but I need to feel that, and then I can just modulate the throttle and I can really be quick in that situation. Other drivers may say, I need the back end, I need to feel the back end a bit loose because I love to feel the front getting into the car. The minute I turn the steering, I want to feel the front of the car going in. And that's oversteer. And though any of those three drivers, if you ask them, how is the balance? If it's away from what they want it to be, they'll say, oh, the balance is out a bit. I want a bit more oversteer, a bit more understeer, whatever. And quite often when I meet a young driver or a driver I don't really know, quite often my first question to them, if we're getting down to racing, is to say, what do you want? What do you like to have from a racing car? And 9 times out of 10, they all say, oh, I want a really good front end, and then I want a really good back end, and I need the car to be quick on the straight. And I said, yeah, that's obvious. But if you had one or the other, which would you want? And then they start thinking about it. And it's quite interesting to see how their brains work and what they actually think they do well. That's a way of finding out what they think they do well, which is always a nice way of understanding how a driver works. And so balance is an overused word. Quite often a driver will say, oh yeah, the balance was out, too much this. But of course another driver, if he got in the car, may not feel that the balance was out, and he can cope with that. And then there's grip. There's two things. So you can have a great balance. A driver can feel completely in harmony with what the car's doing in terms of how it slides, what he does to control the slide, and everything will feel really quick. But then he looks at the stopwatch or the times at the end of the lap, and he's a second and a half off the pace. Now that's not because the car's imbalanced, it's because the grip level's slow by a second and a half. And then what happens is they try to improve the grip level by possibly changing the roll bar settings or the stiffness settings of the car, the roll settings, or maybe or other adjustments to do with ride height. And the balance will go away, and all of a sudden he's got more understeer, and he'll come in and say, oh, I've got understeer now. Oh yeah, but you're going a second lap quicker because you've got more grip. And they think, oh, that's interesting. Okay, we'll see if I can just get rid of the understeer, I'll be really quick. And they get rid of the understeer and they're slow again. So balance it's also a balance between grip and feeling comfortable in the car. And the great racing drivers don't necessarily look for balance. They look for the highest possible grip level for the best possible top speed, and then they try to find a way of driving that car to make it work without taking away any of the elements that comprise grip or low drag. And that's that's the moment when the great drivers go away to the back of the garage and they think about it. Yeah, I know how the car is now. It's got a lot of grip and it's really quick. But Joe, my engineer, has just said that I can only do 3 laps like that because it's going to destroy the left front. So I've got to think of a way of driving this car without changing anything so that I don't destroy the left front. I've got to think of how I'm going to do that. That's how the great drivers work. The lesser drivers think in terms of, oh, well, if the left front's going, we need to put more front wing on, and then they start adjusting the car. And that's where, and I've said a few times, you know, if you put Max and Lewis in the Alpha Tauris or the Haas Ferraris or the Alfa Romeos, they wouldn't instantly be quicker, much quicker than the guys that are in them. But over a 5 or 6 race period, for sure they would be, because they would be, just by default, they would be working on things to improve the car that the engineers can use to make the car faster as distinct from making the car more comfortable to drive. And that's how the great drivers operate. Without really knowing it, they're also great test drivers as a result. But all they're really doing is just driving the car according to the way the car wants to be driven at that level of grip and downforce. And it's not obviously it's not an easy thing. And the great drivers are very good at knowing what to talk about, what needs to be adjusted, and what they can probably make up for with their own talent. That is a really difficult, because it requires a certain amount of self-confidence. And Nigel Mansell was really good like that. You know, if Colin Chapman said to, even when he wasn't in the competitive cars, if Colin said, yeah, but you know, if you want that traction, Nigel, you're going to have to find a way of driving the car. And Nigel, okay, I will, you know, and did. And that's, you know, that's the sign of a great racing driver, in my view. Good question. You know, a lot of other nuances that are attached to that, which I haven't gone into. But thank you very much, Luca, for that question. Very good. Very good. Simple question about a simple concept. Yeah, but you know, we have. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Suzuka lap, because it's a great circuit. And it's I've often said, you know, it's probably the greatest circuit that we race on right now. I miss Sepang, but it's a wonderful track. And most of the racing drivers out there are saying the same thing. And remember, this circuit has been around since the early 60s, commissioned by Honda, designed by John Hugenholtz, who'd done a very good job with Zandvoort. That's probably why they commissioned him. And it was designed as a test track. Can you think about that? A test track designed by a car company, created by a car company in the mid-60s, is still a phenomenal Grand Prix venue today. I mean, there's absolutely no parallel for that. It's designed as a test track. So let's just have a look at the Suzuka lap, because this is courtesy of AMG Mercedes. So thank you very much. That's why the finishing straight in the pits are in turquoise, Petronas turquoise. So why I love Suzuka. You see where it's got, I mean, it's a downhill pit straight for a start, which makes it quite interesting. Going plunging downhill into what they call their turn 1. And of course, it is turn 1 in terms of everything we're going to get from the FIA and everybody else all weekend. Only reason I say that is because for me, turn 2 in reality is, I would call it turn 1B, because it's all part of the same corner. But often you see them distinguishing, they put up these delineations of turn 1, turn 2, and I think that's misleading, because turn 2 isn't actually a separate corner. You can't do well in turn 2 unless you've got turn 1 really good. So you can see the approach speed there. Turn 1, they got 280 kilometers an hour. Yeah, you can see it's very quick going in. And the reason I say all that is because there's not much to be gained out of turn 2 other than to be perfectly positioned for the entrance to the S's. There's not enough straight for turn 2 in its own right to be a place where you can gain a massive amount of time. You can lose time out of turn 2, and if you lose time out of 2 and you come out too wide from 2, it's going to affect the next corners right through to Dunlop, turn 7. So absolutely flat out through turn 1, and then it's really, really interesting because you've got load on the car and you've got to slow the car like crazy for turn 2, what they call turn 2, I call 1B. And that's one of the bits where you're going to see a Max or a Lewis or a Charles if he's on it, and possibly even Carlos Sainz now, he's so confident, really manipulating the car beautifully. And they'll make it look as if it's on rails, but there'll be a massive amount of footwork and to some extent minuscule handwork that will be creating that beautiful platform they'll have between those two corners. And that's one of the great parts of any racetrack in the world, I think, that bit between 1 and 1B, or turn 2 as they call it. So they get the car stopped, and then, because it's quite slow there, you can see how much slower they're going. 130, second gear, 6th down to 8th down to 2nd. And imagine in the days of Ayrton, when he was manual shifting and heel and towing down there. Wow. And then out of 2, as I say, the only thing they need to be thinking of there at that moment is they've got the S's ahead. So you want to be middle of the road, absolutely at a minimum, and preferably a little bit on the right of centre going into what they call turn 3. And the turn 3, 4, 5 are relatively line locked. It's not that difficult to be very good through those 3 corners. And they're the 3 corners where a lot of Formula 1 drivers say, I love the S's, I love the uphill section at Suzuka. It's a great feeling, as you can imagine, that sort of change of direction at relatively high speed. We're talking 6th gear, 5th gear, going down a little bit. It's a bit like Beckett's there. Not quite as quick. Well, yeah, it is a bit like Beckett's, yeah. Really nice. And it's going uphill, which has an interesting effect as well. But then comes the really important bit, which is this last part. And this is never very well covered by television, sadly, so you're not going to see much of it. But quite often I stand on the outside of, you see where the 07 is? I stand on the other side of the track at the beginning of that left-hander, because there you can see who's already thinking of the exit of 7 in the middle of 6. And you need to compromise 6 for sure. And you see many drivers coming out of 6 and going so quickly into 6 because they're into so much rhythm that they ask too much of the car to get it properly positioned for 7. And that's one of the great mistakes you can make at Suzuka, in my view, because if you got the car, manipulate the car well, and you're doing lovely rotation in 6, you're going to be perfectly positioned for 7. We're talking Max here, and Lewis and a few others. Maybe Oscar Piastri, I think, will be good there. Liam Lawson will probably run a bit wide, knowing Liam, but he'll probably get it together there. And assuming he's in the car, I don't know if he is or isn't. I think he probably will be, but we'll see. Because 7 is a really important corner. As you can see, it's got a straight afterwards, serious straight, leading up to the Degners. And that's called Dunlop. Where they've got 7, I would call that Dunlop. And that's a great bit of road. I mean, the actual bit of the entry to Dunlop is nothing special, but all of the special bit is between what they've got turn 6 and turn 7, and how you get the car prepared for turn 7. And bear in mind the rhythm that they've just been in. That's why so many drivers are caught out there. If turn 6 existed in isolation, it wouldn't be anything like as difficult a corner. And then you accelerate the 7. And these 2 Degners, turn 8 and 9, Degner 1, Degner 2, are... that you can see the first one is quick, but it falls away big time. Turn 8, the road camber goes away and it goes downhill. So impossible not to have understeer there, in my experience. So it's how a driver manipulates the understeer and neutralizes the effect of the road falling away in the negative camber that makes them a great Grand Prix driver, or not. That's a second place. It's a really technical, difficult, is that the right word for it? But it's a beautiful bit of road to watch from as well. And I've watched many a practice qualifying session from the outside of Degner 2 and coming into Degner 1. Really good. Then there's that straight, and Degner 2 is obviously critical because you got that straight and you got to get it absolutely right. And how do you cure understeer? It's going to be extra steering lock, obviously, but at exactly the right moment. I'll just come back to me. Exactly the right moment. And it's all to do with the rates of input being absolutely perfect. And you'll see a lot of guys going in and maybe the rate of input will be slightly too spiky or slightly too late, perhaps. and the car will just go on downhill negative camber. It's really, really important part of the road. So then you got that straight, and then you got the right kink, which I call the Eddie Irvine kink, because that unbelievably is where Eddie Irvine lost the 99 World Championship, crashing on that kink before the hairpin. Don't ask me, but he did. But it is a quick kink, that, obviously, and the car is, you need to be online there. And it's a great bit of road as well, because you go through that kink and you come out of it going very quickly, but then you've got to stop the car with load on it for that hairpin, which is why you see quite a lot of guys like Lewis, very good example, very rarely even think about an apex, a geometrical apex in that hairpin. They're always just going around constant radius, relatively middle of the road, even to the outside of the corner, because the really critical thing for there is to be able to get the car into the hairpin without compromising it through the kink or the braking from the kink. You just want the car completely flat there, and you want to be as obviously flat on the throttle as well. And you don't lose any time, it seems, by not having any sort of racing line in that hairpin. There's obviously a lot of grip mid-corner and on the outside. Then they accelerate out of there through that right-hander. Really nice graphic piece of road. TV does do this section of road justice. But it isn't a piece of road where you're going to see a big difference between many drivers. It is what it is. You're just accelerating hard through there. But then, of course, there is that tightening right-hander as they come into what I would call spoon, which is the double apex left-hander. And it's the double apex left-hander is relatively straightforward, quite a late second apex. And there, I think racing line is quite important. There's not a lot you can do in terms of short corners there. It's all about feel and obviously getting a great exit for that run down to 130R. And that's all about the entry into turn 13. So it's all about the car being as flat as you can make it with a change of direction that you've got, and braking at exactly the right rate so as not to unsettle the front or the rear. And that's a big issue because it's always quite slippery there as well. A friend of mine, Jimbo Foley, who's an FOM cameraman, was stationed on a raised scaffolding camera shot on the outside of Spoon several years ago. And it was a Formula Dream, which is the equivalent of Japanese Formula Ford, Honda-supported single-seater category race. And they were filming it. And one car touched. And Jimbo, and it just flew in the air towards this camera location. And Jimbo just kept the camera running. And the car missed him by about 2 inches. There were graze marks on the side of the scaffolding from the thing. Amazing. Jimbo, one of the best. And so and then you got that straight. I'm presuming there's mega DRS there and DRS on the pit straight. I would imagine 2 DRS. They got the DRS on here marked? Can't see it. Maybe. Anyway, that long straight. And then 130R, which is not as tight as it used to be. That's where Alan McNish had that massive shunt in the Toyota. I think it was race morning, wasn't it? But it's pretty much, probably looks very daunting approaching it, a bit like Eau Rouge. But when you're actually in it, probably the car feels okay. But then the last corner, that chicane is a really good chicane as well. Because apart from anything else, you can see from the exit of the chicane, there's still that long right-hander where Timo Glock managed to lose a Toyota on that right-hander and have quite a big shunt. So that's not an easy corner. That last corner, turn 17, what is it? Can't even see, man. 18. So it's really small, the image I'm looking at. But the chicane itself is really interesting because it's one of the few corners, one of the few chicanes that I know where the track goes away from you, goes slightly downhill, and there aren't a lot of visual marking points as you're approaching it. And it's very easy there, interestingly, to brake early rather than brake late into that chicane because you've just had the whole Suzuka lap. You've had turn 1, 1B, the S's, the Degners. You've got that braking into the hairpin. You've got Spoon. You've got 130R, unbelievable adrenaline rush. And then you've got the chicane. Oh, I better not blow it. I better brake a little bit earlier here. And quite a lot of the time you see people actually braking too early, which is sad because you can actually brake a lot later than you think into that chicane. And I think it's because visually the road does fall away, and normally you can see markers and people and stuff, but this one you're just looking at a grandstand in the far distance and a bit of sky. So it's a great corner like that as well. I'm famous, of course, for the Senna Prost shunts and other T-boning incidents over the years. And then you come out of there, and if you get it right, it's a relatively straightforward exit, if you get it right. And then you got that long downhill straight. So imagine how quick 1A and 1B look when you're going downhill in a Formula One car into there. Really, really impressive. So that's the lap of Suzuka. And if Max is not quick this weekend, then we'll know that he's just lost all downforce from the RB19. And it was those technical directive after all. Hard to believe that'll be the case. Anyway, there's one little interlude. I'll get back to questions now. Okay, here's the next one. Eugenux. I'm probably pronouncing that completely incorrectly. I'll have another go at it when I actually get it up. The question. Here we go. So. Okay, question. Hi, Peter. Great stuff as always. Thank you very much. Question. How a racer should behave. At Monza, Sainz fought with all his skills and tyres against the Red Bulls, but Leclerc did not, wanting only the P3 from Carlos. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but when I was watching the race, I didn't think that. I just thought, it's quite obvious Leclerc's in the DRS, and obviously Sainz only spent about 3 laps in DRS, I think, in the whole race. And Charles was in the DRS at that late stage of the race. And so it made sense for him, this is my logic, it made sense for him to be there because he can save a bit of fuel. It's easier to drive with the aid of DRS than not. But I'm not, I mean, obviously from Charles Leclerc's point of view, not winning a Grand Prix is a disaster. Whether it's Carlos Sainz winning it or Max Verstappen or anybody else winning it, Charles Leclerc wants to win Grand Prix. He's proved in the past that he is a Grand Prix winner, and that's all he wants to do. So when his teammate's in front of him, he's not going to think, I've got to pass this guy, I'm going to have to win the race. He just thinks, I'll be here, I'm in the DRS, and I'll push him a bit, and he might make a mistake, and I'll win the race. He's not being over-aggressive. I think he's just doing it about right. That's how I saw it anyway. I know a lot of people have gone on about it, and Charles probably did his usual thing of wanting to get the team to, I mean, as he did in Singapore, Carlos needs to pick up the pace a bit and all that sort of stuff. But I just think, what do you expect Charles Leclerc to do? Just suddenly back away and after you, Claude? No, he's a racing driver. To me, that was okay, what he did. It didn't unsettle me at all. And I thought Ferrari did exactly the right thing at Singapore and telling him to get away from Carlos and drop 3 seconds back, which he did. Another nice question from Coloured Question, Matthew Brown. I'll put this one up. This is nice. Thank you, Matthew. Where are we? As you can see, I always need to sort of reboot my brain a little while into these live streams, just so, because I'm doing so much, I need to remember how to do all this every time, because I'm also trying to think and be relatively logical in what I say. So, Peter, maybe a long shot, but I'm just going to say it. Max will be on the Rushmore of Formula One with Schumacher and Hamilton with 7 championships, and Sainz's position in Ferrari, and is the Sainz position in Ferrari ruining Charles? Yeah, I mean, Max has everything going for him. He has the best team in Formula One. As long as Adrian's around, he'll have the best car probably most races. And he's got a safer era than ever before and more races in 1 year than ever before. So why isn't he going to be breaking all of the records out there? That's logical that would happen. Of course, Adrian may retire and Red Bull may lose the plot completely, or they may completely blow it when it comes to the 26 regulations, all of which are causing everybody a lot of headache. And so things could change. But generally speaking, there is absolutely nothing to stop Max Verstappen beating every record that's ever been set by anybody for anything. Not that it'll mean much, because everything in Formula One has changed so much, much more than any other sport, in terms of the qualifying system, number of races, the point scoring system, the safety, most of all, obviously. So that's that. Is it ruining Charles? I think at the moment Charles quite capable of waking up on a Monday morning thinking, right, next tournament, next race, next shot, it'll be okay. I'll have him around Suzuka. That's how he'll be thinking right now. If Carlos Sainz blows him off around Suzuka, then maybe you're right. Maybe Charles at this point will think, yeah, I'm out of here, or I'm going to do something else. I doubt he will, car for car. I'll be very surprised if Charles isn't quicker than Carlos around Suzuka. But of course, that's one thing being equal to another. Obviously, if Charles loses the FP1 or has a gearbox problem or something, that's that doesn't count. But in absolutely square, level, head-on comparison, I'll be a bit surprised if Charles doesn't beat Carlos there. Not that Carlos won't do a good job. I just think Charles will be really good around Suzuka. But then again, his mental state at the moment, he's quite capable, sadly, of making a few mistakes and blowing the lap with that. So that could happen. But there's nowhere else for him to go, is there? I mean, he's not going to get a drive at Mercedes or Red Bull in a hurry. So the only thing that he could do would be take a gamble and try and sell himself to Audi and be at Audi in 26. But it's so far ahead. Wouldn't he be thinking, if I do that, I'm probably not going to get the best of equipment at Ferrari for the next 2 years. It'll all go to Carlos. Do I really want to do that? No, I don't. So I'm not going to do that. So he'll just stay where he is and hope that there'll be swings and roundabouts, and he will improve a little bit politically and mentally and emotionally, and become a bit more stable and win races again. Apropos nothing at all, Carlos Sainz will be at the Ryder Cup in Rome the weekend after this. He loves golf, and he's playing in the celeb section. I don't think it's called the Pro-Am in the Ryder Cup. I think it's a different thing. They have like a celebrity tournament sort of thing, and he's going to be in that. And I think he's quite good. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I don't know how good he is compared with Lando, but I think he is pretty good. So one of the reasons he's probably going quite well as a racing driver is that he's a good golfer. You've got to think of the next shot. You never think of the last shot. You always think of the next one. It's a good sport like that. If you don't have that discipline, you can't compete at all. So there we go. Thank you. So Daniel, this is actually the questioner. It's called Daniel, which is good. I mean, I'm a big Daniel fan. Always have been. Lovely guy. All the rest of it. I'll never forgive him for leaving Red Bull though. For me, doesn't matter what the situation is. You don't leave a team as good as that to go and do what he did. And I was disappointed that he did that. I know he's got another chance now, and I hope it goes well for him, but I just wish he'd never done that. This is from Daniel. I don't think it's Daniel Ricciardo. Hello from Japan. Might be Daniel Ricciardo. What do you make of the Red Bull race performance in Singapore? If they would have gotten a bit luckier with safety car, I could have seen Max catch the DRS train. Admittedly, I'm Dutch, so biased. Yeah, I mean, I said that. I thought he nearly caught Leclerc, didn't he? And I thought he drove very well. I was a bit nervous for him because, as I said, he hasn't spent that much time in the last year in the midfield in a first lap, fighting elbow to elbow with the likes of Kevin Magnussen, and very easy to lose your front wing end plate or damage something, the floor or whatever, in that first corner skirmish when you're midfield, especially if you're Max Verstappen and you're a bit of a target. And yet he got through it all, and he displayed a sort of Niki Lauda-like ability to prevent other people hitting him as much as he was passing them at the right moment and not forcing the issue too much, but just choosing the right moment. And I thought he drove beautifully in traffic against guys like Magnussen, who are not easy to pass anywhere, let alone Singapore, when there's just walls both sides. And he did it. He did it really well. And made the tyres last really well, did all of that. I mean, he could have benefited from more safety cars, obviously. And actually, it was the virtual safety car, I think, that was badly timed, because he he came in 2 laps before that, and it might have affected things a little bit had it come out later or whatever. Surprisingly, only those one safety car, one virtual safety car. So it wasn't the normal Singapore race, let's put it that way. So I thought he did really well, and as I say, he came out of that race thinking the car is back where it normally is, roll on Suzuka, and so every reason to think he did very well. And I think Red Bull did a good job. They started on the right tyre because they had to second guess what everybody else was going to do, and that was going to be the medium, so they'd run the hard. But again, they could have been wrong. A few of them could have come with the hard as well. But it enabled Max to drive out of sequence with everybody else, apart from Checo, and he did that extremely well. So good, yeah. Thank you for that. There's another question here about. I'm just reading it very quickly before I open it. It's about Charles and understeer. I don't know if I've missed anything here, but I know the people there, and he's not struggling with understeer at all. He's struggling with a lot of things. It's not just understeer specifically, and he's quite capable of handling understeer. Thank you very much. Anyway, we'll see what. I suspect this is some quote that's been taken out of context. Cruella Boy 12. Hi Peter, hope all is well. Thoughts on Charles currently struggling with understeer as Max did last year with the Red Bull and the subsequent increase in performance from their teammates? I saw Max last year occasionally get beaten by Sergio Perez because Perez actually is better than Max, probably still is slightly, in being able to put the power down, particularly on 90-degree corners, quick corners that are over before they've started almost. And he's just really good on traction, applying the power to the rear. I've never, ever seen Max not be able to drive with understeer, ever. He's one of the best drivers I've ever seen coping with understeer. And I'd say the same for Charles Leclerc. So I'm a bit confused by all of this stuff about understeer. Lack of grip in general, yeah, of course, every driver wants more grip. But if 2 drivers in the world are good at dealing with understeer, it's Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc for sure. Charles definitely, as I said in the video, for me, Charles' problem, which I think is what everybody wants to talk about, he's definitely spikier with his inputs than he was when he was winning races. And that has arisen a bit like a golfer with a faster backswing under pressure. It's arisen because of the pressure he's under, not necessarily from Carlos, but at Ferrari. First, there's been a long time when he was trying to assert himself as the key driver at Ferrari, and he would have been pushing for Freddie Vasseur to come for sure, and he would have been pushing for changes to the strategy team, and all that's kind of happening, not completely, but it's kind of happening. And now it's kind of as Charles wanted it. And Carlos, meantime, has just had his head down and done a really good job on what he does well, which isn't actually quite as quick as Charles at his best, but it's very near it. And he's just got better and better and smoother and more consistent. As I said, sort of Rubens Barrichello-like in terms of consistency. And all of a sudden, Charles looking at it now, and he's kind of got the team he wanted. And wow, Carlos Sainz has made a lot of progress. And it's added to the pressure that he's under. And as a result, his inputs have become out of sync with the car. I've often used that phrase, which I actually coined by Rob Wilson, so all credit to him, the rate of input. And the rate of input is a phrase to describe a driver being in perfect harmony with what the car requires in order for its dynamic weights to be perfectly managed. And if you know that you need to give it a little bit more throttle, that isn't enough. It's the rate at which you give it the throttle. That is the key thing. And it's that rate of input, in my opinion, watching him on the circuit, that Charles has lost a little bit. It's the rate of his inputs, footwork and handwork. I can't see the footwork, but you can kind of see it with the body language of the car. And everything's slightly more abrupt with Charles now. Still short corners, but everything is slightly lumpier and spikier. And he needs, and this probably won't happen until the winter, but he needs time to reboot and to think about it and to relax. And he needs people to tell him that, obviously. Whether that happens is another matter as well, of course. Probably will. He's got good people around him. So that's the difference. It's not a question of not being able to handle understeer or oversteer or bad traction or whatever it is. He's just, all his rates of input are out of sync slightly. And they will come back. He'll be back, absolutely for sure. But, you often see in golf, you look at, say, Justin Thomas at the moment, he's basically hasn't been hitting the ball very well for about 9 months now. But everybody goes through that, even at that level. And providing you keep working hard at the fundamentals and you don't lose focus, and you treat the next shot as the one that matters, it'll come back. It'll come back like that. And it'll come back for Charles too. I've no doubt about that. The guy's too good for it not to be soluble. So we've got a nice question from M.A. Khan, I think, is another of our regulars. Thank you very much, M.A. Khan. Get this one up now. I did start this ambitiously saying I thought we'd get through everything, but now I'm possibly going to have to revise that because I see it's already an hour and a half into the live stream virtually, and I have got a lot on today. I got a Zoom call after this to do with the ongoing next phase of the exhibition. Interesting. M.A. Khan. M. Hughes' report on Schumacher's injuries prior to his Merc comeback included broken neck, fractured skull, neuron damage. How would the reduced sensitivity in his legs have impacted his driving? Was that from that motorcycle accident he had? I guess so. And also the shunt at Silverstone in '99, obviously, when the brakes failed into Stowe. Well, it didn't really impact his driving. I mean, in terms of his... When did he do that motorcycle thing? It was about halfway through his Ferrari career, wasn't it? I think so. I think the last sentence should be, how would that possibly have impacted the injury he incurred in the skiing accident? That's, I think, more apposite. I don't think it affected his driving. I think when we saw him at Mercedes, he wasn't absolutely in sync with everything that was going on. But last year he was there, Monaco, I think he was quickest at Monaco, if I remember rightly, and then he had a penalty or something, but he certainly was quickest, I think, in qualifying, and he had a few other really good performances. So I'll tell you one thing, in '99 when he did have that shunt, and Irvine was then in box seat to win the World Championship for Ferrari with Mika Salo in the other car. I remember I wrote a piece actually for the Sunday Times saying, I wouldn't be surprised if Michael forces the issue to have a regulation to enable him to race with a hand throttle. And because in my view, Michael would have had the coordination and the ability to race pretty well with a hand throttle. And I asked Ross Brawn once whether that was ever talked about. And he said, no, never, which just surprises me because, being a guy who was quick on a motorbike as well, I think Michael could have done that, but maybe the FIA wouldn't have allowed it anyway, so it's a moot point. But yeah, I think I've answered that question. I think it was more maybe that made the result of the skiing accident sadly worse than it should have been. I don't know. I just don't know really. I don't think any of us do. We just think of Michael a lot. Barely a day goes by when I don't think of Michael and everything that, he was as a racing driver. I've still got the Foca Pass at the end of the year he signed saying, hi, Peter, keep it up, I think he said, something like that. I think I know what he meant by that. Elliot Davidson. Hi, Peter, could you please talk about how drivers in the past have manipulated the throttle mid-corner to aid rotation, and if it's still used in the modern era? P.S. We need short corner T-shirts. Well, I mean, absolutely, rotation. I mean, I've said several times that Lewis Hamilton and Nigel Mansell were two of the most patient drivers I've ever seen, because they actually spend quite a lot of time mid-corner, rotation area, with no throttle at all and no brake either. They just let the car settle, and they're just waiting for that perfect moment. They're just working on the rotation angle and then they're accelerating out. And that was always characteristic of Nigel's driving, even in the Lotus days. I described in the last live stream, I think, Nigel in the 1980 Dutch Grand Prix qualifying Elio De Angelis's car, and I was standing behind the garage area overlooking Hunzerug, acceleration of the Hunzerug, the left-hander behind the pits. And even on that lap, when Nigel was only 0.2 slower than Elio, under massive pressure, I can remember as if it was yesterday, Nigel mid-corner in the Lotus 81, absolutely silent, nothing going on with the engine, nothing at all. Just and you have this moment of, initially you think, wow, what's happened? And then another moment you think, this guy just knows exactly what he's doing. And you feel that the corners like that, Mirabeau at Monaco is a similar thing. A great Grand Prix driver, you can always see them slightly just off the throttle in the middle of the corner with the car just, and then you know it's a super quick lap because everything is perfectly in line. Carlos was like that a lot, particularly in the Williams in 1980. So it's not actually throttle. I'm getting to the point there. He's manipulated the throttle mid-corner. It's not so much manipulating the throttle. It's knowing when to just let the car rotate and settle. And in terms of throttle manipulation, it is never a jab on the throttle. This is, now we can talk about Sergio Perez because now the car's rotated. Now we're waiting for the moment when we can get on the power. And just, if you want to think about how to do that, watch Sergio Perez and the way he drives. He's unbelievably good in the way he puts the power down. I'd be really fascinated to know whether he has a different throttle spring tension to Max. I'm sure if he has, Max has by now copied it because whatever Sergio's doing there, it's incredibly good. And it's just obviously it's not a jab, but equally it's not just a constant movement either. It's absolutely feeling the moment when you can get the power on. Now, Ayrton always used to jab the throttle at that moment, which to my mind was a fault because every time he jabbed the throttle, the nose of the car was moving slightly. Well, not the nose, but the weight of transfer was coming into play. And it was always that. And he couldn't get out of that habit. It was always like that. And that was his way of feeling the moment to get the power on. So it was never a linear thing with Ayrton, where it always was with Prost. I mean, Prost, I've got to say, Prost, right up there with Sergio Perez as well. Unbelievably good throttle application from the mid-corner point onwards. Absolutely silky smooth. Incredible. I don't think that was Carlos. I think Carlos was better into the corner. Nigel was really good in that area as well. Better than Piquet for sure. You'd see Piquet doing one of these occasionally, but Nigel would always be super good there. Michael, yeah, I'd say Michael was brilliant there as well. Wow, all these details you're coming up with, all you viewers, it's unbelievable. Thank you so much. The final part of the question, is it still used in the modern era? So is the throttle, I mean, you're saying to aid rotation. To me, the rotation point is achieved, basically you're braking into it. You're slowing the car down all the time. And you're coming out of the brake pedal pressure also at a secret rate relative to the moment when you're going to start loading up the steering even more. And that match of how much you're coming out of the brake pedal pressure and loading up the steering, controlling the understeer, is Kimi and Charles, is all about feel, and it's all about feeling. That's when the great drivers are showing why they're great. It's because they're not getting understeer in driving a car in such a way that 99% of the world's population would get understeer if they did what they're trying to do, and yet they don't get understeer. And that's why I keep saying, to say Charles has got trouble with understeer. I mean, maybe he's got trouble with understeer because his inputs are a bit spikier now, and he's doing what he used to do in terms of short corners. But because he's a bit spikier, the car is starting to understeer. Maybe that's why he's potentially saying that. But when Charles was on it, winning Grand Prix, he was as good as eliminating the potential for understeer as anybody I've seen in recent times, that's for sure. Let's have a look at another one now. So everybody has a bit of a breather when I do all this, I hope. Bit of a pain, isn't it? On the other hand, it's nice when I get the question up there and we can see what we're talking about. What's this one? Diggy Daz 2007. G'day, mate. Hi, Peter. You're the best in the game and we love you. Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind. At this point, given the clear successes and maturity shown by Liam Lawson, should the AlphaTauri seat be given to him rather than signing Daniel? Well, I think, yeah, is the answer to that. If I was, is it Menkes, I think, is joining as the new team principal. That's what I would do. Because I think Liam is a real talent. I'm not sure he's as short corner stroke polished as Piastri, but he's definitely a counterpoint in that what he does incredibly well, and he's got. I tend to try to stay away from saying, oh, he's got great car control on the basis that everybody out there, most of them anyway, have great car control. Lance Stroll, please advise. No, I shouldn't say that. And but he's very good. He's like Carlos Sainz, with a very young head on his shoulders, but he kind of knows what he does and how he does it, and he wants that, and he makes it work. And I love that about watching Liam Lawson. I've always thought he was good. I once said to Ollie Oakes, who knows them both really well, I think they both have lived with Ollie Oakes' family for a year each or something like that. Marcus Armstrong, and both are Kiwis, of course. And I said, so who's the better of the two then, Ollie? And he said, oh, don't ask me that. I've always felt it was Liam just, but he's a big Marcus Armstrong fan as well. So maybe we get to see him. What's he doing anyway, Marcus Armstrong, this year? Bit of a wasted talent, isn't it? A lot of wasted talent out there. It's so difficult. So difficult. And they're all too busy to do interviews. No, they're not. That's just one. I'm sure there's a lot out there. And now Diggy Daz wants to extend his question. Good one. Let's have a look at this. Where are we? Or perhaps, to extend my question, should Liam Lawson be slipped into Checo's seat for 24 and grow him at Red Bull? At this point, he seems like with the right experience, he could handle it. Yeah, I think he could. You know, I think there's another young, quick guy out there, Kimi Antonelli, who I think is going from Freck straight into Formula 2. I think. I may be wrong. I think he's driving for Prema or something. Maybe wrong. We'll see. And under that heading, absolutely for sure, Liam Lawson would do a good job in Checo's car. Whether Red Bull will do that kind of depends on the furore it would cause in Mexico, ongoing contracts with Mexican sponsors, etc., and whether or not they want to survive if they go back to Mexico. So it's that. I mean, why do that really when they can have him in the AlphaTauri? No reason really. More difficult question really is what they're going to do about not continuing with Honda and Yuki Tsunoda doing quite a good job in that other car in terms of scoring points. Although Singapore, he got involved in the first corner, didn't he, and damaged the bodywork or radiators or something. Would they want to keep him if they're not going to be tied to Honda anymore and they're switching to Ford for 26, Ford branding for the Red Bull powertrain? That's so, in theory, Liam's got a slot in some form or another, I would imagine, in AlphaTauri. And that's why, as much as Red Bull, I'm sure, would love to sell AlphaTauri for the right money to the right person, Michael Andretti for $1 billion, which isn't going to happen, of course. If they do continue with it, they'll have to, it's a good place to put somebody like Liam Lawson because he's too good not to put in the car. I'm sure that's what they think. So Daniel would be quite nervous at the moment, I suppose. I think if they confirm Yuki Tsunoda or not for next year, I'm not sure. If they haven't, I suppose Daniel, Liam would be a good team, wouldn't it? And if they have, then you'd have to be looking for Liam to replace Daniel, I guess, yeah. I mean, he's done a good enough job. No surprise there, to be honest. I'm surprised they didn't put him in the car anyway, before they put Daniel back. Okay, Tacitus Gilgore says, talking to all the viewers, guys, you don't need to fill the chat way before the stream starts with inane questions that Peter might answer in the preamble. Think about your questions more. Well, you're a braver man than I, Tacitus. I wouldn't have said that. And I think think of one really good question per stream, he says. Okay, I kind of leave it to you, but please, I don't mind. If people want to ask questions that they think might have been answered, don't hesitate, because it's a long stream, 2 hours. I think it's a long stream. And I don't mind what people do, providing you're not rude or difficult. Ask me questions that I know the answer to, please. But thank you very much for caring, I guess is what I really mean to say. So another one here. I know this is all building up to not getting through all the questions again, I guess, isn't it? So that's apologising in advance if that happens. I blame it all on Dexter the dog. Too much time being spent on Dexter. Hi, Peter. For me, George still lacks in race pace to Lewis. Lewis gained 5/10 on him per lap in the last stint when they were both in clean air. Is this due to driving style or just ability? No, this is due to exactly what I was talking about before, but I won't. I don't mind at all repeating it. This is due to the fact that Lewis was doing a better job with his tyre management, and George was not impetuous. He was just being George, being Jochen Rindt, absolutely on the limit. New set of tyres. I'm going to win this Grand Prix. Go for it. And don't forget, there's a background here, which is from George's point of view. If you think about George and his career, forget about doing the best job for Mercedes or getting the best from the tyres or the car. The only thing George wants to do is beat Lewis, really. That's the only thing he needs to be doing, because at some point Lewis isn't going to be there. He's going to retire. And then George will be, the next Lewis. That's how he sees it. And so all he wants to do is beat Lewis as much as he can, because that's the yardstick. That's the gold standard. So if his tyres go off 4 laps from the end, so be it. He'll take that gamble. Whereas Lewis has been around so long and drives so well and has such a great ability to think of the last lap of the race when there are still 30 to go, that he is going to manage his tyres correctly and he is going to drive the car correctly. And his inputs are going to be less spiky and reflexy than George's. And he isn't going to be driving reactively to what the car is going to be doing. He's going to be manipulating the car. Now, those little things, that manipulating the car, don't necessarily add up to 1/10 of a second on a quick lap in qualifying. On the contrary, it might actually slow you down a little bit. But in the race, when it is about tyre management and it is about avoiding debris and it is about the track surface changing according to the ambient and stuff offline, it really adds up. And that's what Lewis is. That's what Lewis always has been. He's been this consummate race driver. And that's what George isn't yet. But he's a phenomenal qualifier. Absolutely phenomenal. And that's why you see that. And it's, it does Lewis a disservice, I think, to say, as I did earlier, George is probably quicker now over a lap than Lewis, because all that's looking at is a tiny part of the race weekend. It's not looking at what Lewis does so well. And, Nico, Valtteri Bottas periodically out-qualified Lewis as well, but didn't actually change anything from Lewis's point of view. It was always the race. And that's what Lewis does so well. And you're absolutely correct. Lewis drove that last stint really well, which is why I said in the Sunday video, he could have potentially have won that race if he hadn't had George in front of him. I'm not sure Mercedes see it that way. And I don't know how Mercedes see it, whether they just see George as just getting better and better and he's quicker and quicker, and Lewis, old Lewis brought the car home third. I don't know what they think. It's difficult to imagine, but what I do think is that Lewis is still an amazingly good racing driver. He drove really well, I thought, at the weekend. Back to M.A. Khan. Good question again. You always ask good questions. I see, because I've just been cheating and having a look a little bit at what you're asking about. So we'll look at this. Yeah, has Lewis changed his driving since McLaren? He was definitely closer to Max's short corners as opposed to Alonso. He's now slightly longer corners and more flair in his driving. Is this deliberate? Well, no, I said from Monaco onwards, he has been definitely trying to energize the tyres more, because I think he saw the way George drives with his slightly longer corners and a bit spikier inputs. I think Lewis, typically Lewis, always learning, always changing, always adjusting, started to do that as well. If that was the way to get the tyre temperatures to work, that was better than having cold temperatures and never getting any grip, which is what he'd been going through. At least if he had grip and he was energizing the tyres more, even if the sweet spot was very small, Lewis, could probably do a better job of managing that sweet spot than George. And I think that's what he did. And I think he still kind of does that whenever tyre temperatures are an issue. And don't forget, in Singapore, they weren't really. It was a relatively soft compound. But Suzuka, it is the hard compound again, the hardest in the range. In fact, let's just have a look at that. Here you go. You can see there, this is all the compounds they've been running all year on the Pirelli graphic. And you can see for Japan, they've got this hard tyre again. The tyre they had in Spain, the compound in Spain and Silverstone and Zandvoort, the compound that McLaren seemed to love. And that's on the basis that Suzuka's very tough on tyres anyway, and potentially it's going to be quite hot there. But they didn't know that then, but I think it is going to be quite hot from what I can see. I may be wrong there, but that's the last I saw. So on that basis, let's assume the ambients are off a bit. They're running the hard Pirellis. That could be a place where you need to get temperatures again, and you'll see Lewis slightly longer corners, maybe even slightly deliberately spikier inputs just to get the tyres energized. And he's definitely been doing that. And I think that ability to do that and to see that, and to see that that's possible is probably not something that he had in his repertoire when he was at McLaren, when he was basically just refining what he'd always done up until that point, which was short corners, soft and supple, very, warm the car before applying the full extent of the brakes. All those things worked really well for him in the entire McLaren period. And it's only when the car's been off the boil that he's had to start thinking about how to do that. And I think it's great credit to Lewis that he has managed to change the way he drives, because it must feel, to quote Ayrton Senna, when I asked him once about jumping a gear, going from fourth to second instead of going fourth, third, second, it would have felt like playing a wrong note on a piano, and it probably does to Lewis as well. But which is probably why when you get him in a moment, he probably doesn't really enjoy the current Grand Prix cars much anyway, because he's having to drive in such a foreign way. But I think that's what it's. Sorry, I've kept this picture up, the graphic, for too long. I forgot to go back to Peter Windsor. There we go. One thing I do forget, it's easy to forget to do that. Before I go any further as well, I want to just talk about this book as well, which has just come out. And because it's the preview to the Japanese Grand Prix, no better moment than to talk about it and welcome it onto the bookshelves of the world, or more likely into the internet of the world. Lionel Lucas, who's already done a great job with a book on helmets in Formula One, has just done a 2-volume, absolutely definitive work on Honda. Superb. This is the cover of volume 2, which is more about the racing cars and the racing side of Honda. But volume 1 is more about the road cars. But he's shown me a WhatsApp reply he got from the chairman of Honda saying, this is it, you've done the job. Nobody else needs to do anything about Honda, because this is the definitive work about Honda. And I've actually got it here. It's a lovely book, and you will not be surprised that there's some amazing photographs. And the best section of the book is undoubtedly this bit, which begins here. Oh, sorry, I've got to come back again to Peter Windsor. So what am I doing? Here we go. So there you see, I would counsel anybody with any interest in Formula One, let alone the great Honda eras, to get hold of this book. It is absolutely superb, beautifully produced as well. Really, really nice. I've got it there. I love getting back from walking Dexter, sitting down, putting the feet up, cool drink, open the book, read another chapter somewhere. Really good. So congratulations to Lena Lucas for that. Good job. Something else has come up. I'd like to just know what everybody thinks of this. It's very odd, isn't it? I mean, it's the absolute essence of it. I totally get, because biodiversity is something that, you know, any animal lover would totally support. But I actually don't really understand what it means. So Buzzen Corner, racing for biodiversity, great. So this is a Sebastian Vettel thing. Sebastian Vettel is inviting Formula One drivers, team principals and team managers to join him at the Buzzen Corner to raise awareness for biodiversity. The B, as a black and yellow ambassador for Sebastian's project, Buzzen Corner, Racing for Biodiversity, represents all insects and presents its striking colours in Turn 2 at Suzuka Circuit. Therefore, I think it means 1B. Therefore, only the curbs of Turn 2 are black and yellow, and the installation of 11 insect hotels is a sign of our global problem of dwindling biodiversity. The Buzzing Corner in Japan is the starting point for future buzzing corners on the racetracks around the world. Yep, well, there you go. I think I'll let you guys decide what to do. I'm very happy to support it in any way I can. I think it's, you know, anything that supports biodiversity in Formula One, I'll go for it. I can't imagine how easy it is to do that, however, Formula One being what it is. But anyway, there we go. Good old Seb. Good to know what he's doing now. So here's another question. Yeah, I think I kind of answered this one, but no problem, because, you know, it's difficult to keep up with. It's like when you're WhatsApping somebody and you reply to them and they've already asked another question and they think the reply you've just given them is relevant to the next question. Happens to me all the time. How do you rate Max's drive to P5 in Singapore? At best, he seemed to have the fourth fastest race car, but he kept his nose clean, given he's not been in this position for quite some time now. Well, on the basis that Max, as I said, is saying in the preview to Suzuka, let's keep the momentum going from the race in Singapore, I think he feels he'd had much more than the fourth fastest car. I think he felt he had a very, very good racing car in Singapore. From where he was on the grid, he had to run, you know, hard tyres and everything else. So it was impossible really to judge exactly where they were. But they didn't seem to be in anything like the dramas they were in during Friday and Saturday practice and qualifying. So I think they were more, the car was a pretty good car in the race. That's not detracting. I'm just saying, you know, the car was quite good. Excuse me. It must be all this biodiversity and all the pollen. So I think he did well, as I said, and kept his nose clean, as I said. That's not an easy thing to do if you're a double world champion who everybody's got in his sights, especially if you're Kevin Magnussen. And but the proof will be how he goes this weekend in Suzuka. It'll be interesting. More than anything else, it'll be interesting to see how the Charles Carlos thing goes, and it'll be interesting to see, well, more than interesting, it'll be absolutely critical to see how the Red Bulls go. Nate, hello mate. Hello mate, Nate. Could Max, I won't put this out, it's kind of the same thing, me, one Joss. Could Max have reached the podium if they would have pitted during the safety car? I think you mean, I don't know, maybe you mean the first safety car when he stayed out and got track position up to P2. It was well before their stopping point on the hard tyre, and he did have track position, which is always a good thing. You never know what's going to happen. There might have been another safety car within 10 laps or so. So he got that P2, then he got gazumped, but then he found the more the tyres wore away, he then found a bit more groove and pace on those hard tyres, which is why they didn't bring him in immediately after that. And the only other issue was then the virtual safety car, which came out 2 laps after he'd stopped for the new mediums. So that's the thing that might have made a difference if that had come out, if he'd stopped a bit earlier or it had come out a bit sooner. But I don't think there was any way you would have stopped Max at the first safety car because he had track position. You know, he'd gone from midfield to P2, and it was too early. It wouldn't have worked. I don't think he would have been down in wherever position, P15 or something. He would have had all that traffic again. So this is Midnight Q. For the first time watching the stream. Well, that's because we're a bit earlier. Good stuff. Hi, Peter from Cronulla, Australia. I've got to put that one up because I used to live not far. Well, Cronulla. That's showing how long I've been out of Australia now. I think Cronulla's North Shore, isn't it? I think so. If not, it's beaches anyway, and good stuff. I grew up in the beaches of Sydney, so it's good to see, good to hear. Thank you very much. All the best to everybody in Cronulla. Cronulla, mate. Yeah, beauty. What happened to Australia first of all, in the last one-day international in South Africa, when they got beaten by that South African player, whose name escapes me, he went completely ballistic. And then they lost the rugby, didn't they, to Fiji. What's that all about? First time Fiji have won since 1954 or something. Lance, Alex, I'm just getting to the people who are joining as we started the stream. It's terrible, isn't it? Not terrible. I'm terrible. Because Lance Alex says, morning, Peter, looking forward to this. Jay Westry, here's an interesting question. Says, here we go. How do you think, well, I'll let you read it. How do you think a driver should prepare themselves right before a race or qualifying? Should the focus be more on the physical or the mindset? Well, it's an interesting question because I've always given Pierre Gasly quite a hard time, and he's not the only one, of course. He does it very publicly for all that business of the reflex stuff on the grid with the balls, tennis balls. But you'll see, behind the garages, you'll see Carlos Sainz doing things like that, the skipping, the reflex stuff. Most of them do that because they've been doing it most of their careers now. If you look at all the Freck races, let alone F3, F2, they're all doing it before the start. And the whole idea is to be really ready for it in terms of agility and reflexes and being totally warm in all those physical areas. And then you got the Jackie Stewart thing of into a first corner, the last thing you need is emotion. You have to be completely calm, drained of emotion, so that all your senses are completely calm and ready to react in any dimension. Makes sense to me, the Jackie Stewart one, because if you are very hyped up, let's say you start with a pulse rate of 174, your thinking and your rationale in very, very small time segments isn't going to be as calm and as clear as if your pulse rate is 112. And I bet Jackie's was around the 112, 108 mark at the start of most Grand Prix. And he didn't have many first corner shunts or issues. He was very, very good in first corners. And quite often you see, Pierre Gasly, it was at Barcelona, I think, 3 years ago, when he pulled up and was on the wrong side of the white line and got a penalty just after the formation lap. That sort of thing, is that carelessness, or is that he's very hyped up and just didn't notice the line there at that moment? It's an interesting one. I think the modern trend is the whole Pierre Gasly reflexy thing, but then again, they do have the music and they do have that time on the grid, don't they? When by definition they are relatively calm. And maybe that's why everybody got more or less through the first corner in Singapore. Lewis had to go down the outside there, didn't he? But they were all pretty good through there. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's what Lance Stroll needed. We haven't talked much about that shunt. Not many questions about it, but I think he had Gasly held him up and somebody else held him up. But for me, and this is only my opinion, I think that accident started in the previous run when he got badly held up by Logan Sargent. And that's because Logan Sargent has been doing a really good job in the second Williams, bought by his family, if you like, in the same way that Lance had been in that Williams, bought by his family. And they weren't happy with it, and so they took him out of Williams and bought him a team to race in called Aston Martin now. And to have Logan Sargent then take that seat and do a pretty good job, to the point where he's actually basically beaten Lance quite recently, 3 times I think, is something that must have irked them. And then he's held him up badly, and it was Sargent's fault, there's no doubt about that. It was to do with Sargent not knowing he was there and all the usual things. But Stroll, that absolutely for sure, that would have absolutely infuriated Lance Stroll. And then he got held up again. And then he did this weird thing of the lap wasn't very good, so I just decided to do everything on the last corner. Well, you know, the last corner, you can only do what you can do, and it's pretty clear what the limit is there, and it's a bit, as I say, it's a bit of a George Russell mistake, because he got the right rear on the curb, and then bang, he was just off like that. But it all began, I think, with the whole traffic business and too much adrenaline. Pulse rate was probably screaming high. Whereas the Jackie Stewart philosophy would have been, whoa, calm down, calm down. And I think Nigel Mansell used to shout at himself on a formation lap just to get himself where he wanted to be. But that was a different thing. That was the commander of an army shouting as they climb out of the trenches, onward, out, go. But when it came to the actual maneuver of what to do, that leader of that major in the army was still able to think very clearly and to do everything in slow motion and do it correctly. And that's the way Nigel was. He used the shouting to create the competitive instinct that he needed in order to be the racing driver he was. But he didn't use it to increase his pulse rate and to make things happen faster than they should have. And he established that balance very early in his career. But he did shout at himself. In the same way I shout at myself sometimes when I'm not doing something right or need to give myself a bit of a kick. Raul, how is Hamilton so kind on his tyres compared with Russell? Well, a lot of that is exactly what I've been talking about. It's just the rate of input of Lewis is perfectly in harmony with what the car requires in order to be balanced in terms of its dynamic energy and dynamic forces. Nothing skewing it from one side to the other or from one end of the car or across the car. Everything is happening in a way that works for the car's sitting squarely on the road, or creating little areas where he's got the car, if he's got to do a change of direction, he lets it just get square for a millisecond before he then puts in the next part, and it's all done very, very softly. Whereas George will be more like that, which feels really quick, and that's the way he drives, reflexy. And he's got the talent to deal with that. It's just that is harder on tyres, and it makes you more prone to mistakes because you've got nowhere to go. Whereas Lewis creates a field of operation that allows him to have areas where he can compensate if something's not quite right. Max does as well. That's why pit drivers like Max and Lewis always look as if they're on rails, because they've always got little areas they can massage just to keep the car right. Whereas a driver like George, more so than Lando, because he's a bit spikier, but a driver like George doesn't have that extra area. Everything's on the edge of the precipice all the time. And if he's the wrong side of the precipice, the car will just drop. So Lewis never gets himself in that position. Very rarely anyway. Occasionally, obviously. They're human beings. It's an interesting one. I didn't realise this. I was too busy. No, what I was too busy doing. I was too busy getting a lift back to the hotel, I think, when this was going on. But says here, what do I think about the situation between Lewis and Mercedes? Mercedes team members didn't show up on the podium. Really? I can't believe that's the case. Maybe the TV cameras didn't show them there. We shouldn't always just stand by what you see on TV, because there's always lots more going on. I'd be shocked if the Mercedes team weren't there. I mean, they're all good guys. Ron Meadows and the team, really, really good, and they would have been there. Lewis's guys would have been there for sure. I mean, George's guys were probably pretty concerned about what state the car was in, bearing in mind they had to pack everything up, and Japan is it was a double header, so that would have got their attention on the last lap, that's for sure. But I think his guys would have been there, wouldn't he? That's all Lewis needs, his mechanics and his engineers. Whether or not Toto was there, irrelevant. Nina DC, hi Peter, hi. Colin T, another one here. So annoying that I'm not going to get through everything. It's actually very humbling to know how many people want to talk about racing and think that I might be a half reasonable person to talk to about it. But then again, I have been around a while. How many journos, as they talk about, can actually say, well, when I was talking to Jim Clark, I can say that. Or when I was with Sterling driving to Silverstone, or whatever I can say. Yeah. Colin T. Hi, Peter. Love your content so much. Thank you very much. All the talk on the AlphaTauri Red Bull seats is that Tsunoda and Ricciardo will drive in the junior team while Perez stays at Red Bull. Why Tsunoda? And what now for Lawson? Well, if that is what's going to happen, that is a bit disappointing, isn't it? Because why? I mean, the reality is Tsunoda's done a good job generally this year. He scored quite a lot of good points from nowhere on the grid, showing a race consistency that's encouraging. But as I say, he's in that car because of the Honda link, and that goes through to the end of 2025, and it's probably a contractual thing, actually, if you think about it. So for Red Bull to not have him would be to affect their relationship with a supplier stroke partner that they're with till at least the end of 2025. So they probably have to keep Tsunoda under that. And then they probably promised Daniel this drive. So I don't know. We've talked about it. We'll speculate about it. Maybe they'll let Daniel do the end of this year and then put Lawson in the car for 24. Maybe that's the compromise. We'll see. Brian, the GOAT, Scalabrine. It's a shame that greatest of all time actually adds up to GOAT, isn't it? Because it's a bit of a oxymoron. Is that the right word? It's a bit odd. Because, it deserves more than to be a goat. Not that I got anything against goats or donkeys. I love them all, but it's just a bit odd. But you're talking about Alberto Ascari and you call him the GOAT. It just doesn't seem right, does it? Brian, the GOAT, Scalabrine. Hi, Peter. Did this race show the racer that Max is? He could have easily given up on Sunday after winning 10 in a row. If it is not a win, it's nothing for him. He drove a great race. Yeah, he did. And I made that point. And you know what? I think he just loves racing. I said that on the video. I think he really would have enjoyed that race because he would have enjoyed that battle with Kevin Magnussen, for sure. Because Magnussen was showing that who's boss, and if Max was going to pass him, he was really going to have to work for it. And he was quite capable of putting him off if he needed to. And yet Max stayed at it and was very good, very aggressive at just the right moment and got the pass. And that's how Max, that was an indication, I think, of the way Max lives his racing life. It's the next race, the next day, the next practice session, the next whatever. And of course, people love to talk to him about 10 in a row and 3 world championships and this and that. But I'm sure genuinely he doesn't think about it very much. He's just thinking about the next race. Right now, whatever it is, Wednesday, he's thinking Suzuka, turn 1, turn 1B, S's, entry to the S's, top of the hill, make sure I got the car exactly right, Dunlop, mega corner, Degners, looking forward to the Degners. That's what he's thinking about. He's not thinking, won 10 in a row, I don't really need to do much more, I'll just cruise around and finish third if I have to. He never thinks that way. He's just a racing driver. Mind you, most of them are like that. I mean, it's nothing unusual. I suppose the only one that really defied the logic was Jody Scheckter, because he was so aggressive and so in your face in the early phase of his Formula One career, and he won the World Championship in 79, and then 80 he just drove around as if he didn't want to be there. Admittedly, the Ferrari was not a very good car, but it was just like, they could have put anybody in that car and they would have been quicker than Jody in 1980. And then he retired at the end of the year. And then you got Nico, of course, retiring even before he sat in the car again after winning the championship. So here's another one from Jesus is the Truth. Yeah, we've had you before, I think. Which, yeah, we have, definitely. So good. A very kind message. Welcome back. I think you mean welcome back from Singapore. Yeah, a bit knackered. But it's kind of weird in Singapore because you do keep European time, bearing in mind everything happens at night. And so now everybody's gone to Japan. I'm glad I am not there, because now they have to adjust to the time change with very few days in which to do that. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't talking to him directly, but I'm quite happy to quote my buddy who was. And he said this is how tough the Formula One life is now, with all these double, triple headers and the way the calendar logistically is laid out across the globe. There is a mechanic who shall remain nameless, and the team will remain nameless because he may not have announced this yet, but he told my buddy, I'm retiring at the end of the year, I can't do this anymore. I've got a wife, I've got 2 kids, I barely see them, my back's killing me, I just can't do this anymore, it's too tough. Too many races, too much pressure, too much. And he's a front jack guy. He's 32 years old. That's how tough Formula One is. And he's very fit. So, yeah, spare a thought for all those guys. And Japan, as lovely as the circuit is and the people are, it's a tough race logistically, get in and out of. It's quite a far part of the country, Nagoya, then out of there, and there's a break. Then it's Qatar. It's just never ending. Anyway, the question is, hope you're good. Yeah, after all that, Sainz is very smart. I think. Don't know if Leclerc had made the same clever ride. Yeah, I know Sainz just drove really well, really good. He, a lot of pressure on Carlos Sainz because he's had these situations before. And we've seen him in races before where he does well, but then fades. I'm not talking about Monza now, because I think Monza he drove really well, but there have been occasions when last year when Ocon won in Hungary. Was it last year? I think so, year before, whatever. Anyway, that race when Ocon won, there was a chance there where Sainz could have been up there. He could have won that race, and he sort of settled back and drove around to finish on the podium. But that Sainz is gone now. Okay, another one. Sainz is definitely, this is the new Carlos 2.0 or 3.0, whatever it is. Here we go. Jay Westry, hey Peter, so Jackie Stewart recently said it's easier for Verstappen to win than it was for him due to Jackie doing 60 plus races a year in different categories and travelling with less luxury. Thoughts? Well, Jackie was asked and was talking about exactly that. I was working with him all weekend in Singapore, and he never said, in my presence, oh, it's much easier for Max Verstappen today. All he ever said was, it's very different for Max Verstappen today. And he actually made the point that he was quite lucky to have this wide expanse of different cars to race in any given season, because, and this is Jackie talking, not me, in 66, for example, and 67, when the BRM wasn't very competitive, 67 more so, Mike Spence in the other car, the H16 was a dog, it was because Jackie was able to race in other categories like Formula 2, Can-Am and so forth, Indy, that he was able to keep his motivation and his buoyancy and to keep racing at the level he was in Formula 1. So again, I would say complete misquoting out of context there, and Jackie never saying that. We asked him specifically what he thought about Max, and he said absolutely superb, doing the job beautifully, really good approach, drives well, drives beautifully, couldn't do a better job in that car, in that team. So not quite sure the only thing that's true there really is that, Jackie had a very different era, and in order to race, in order to make any sort of money, Jackie had to race all over the world and travel across the Atlantic endlessly, as did Jim Clark, as did Graham Hill, as did all of them, Dan Gurney. So nothing new under the sun there. John Surtees. So everything new. But he never said, in my presence anyway, that it's easier, that was easier or is easier for Max than it was for him. Shaq Marriott. There's some good questions here. I'm not going to be able to take many of them, I don't think. Let's have a look. Hi Peter, I hope all's good. Thank you very much. Yeah, did you think... hope it was good. What did you think of Oscar's recovery drive, and also who do you think are the top 5 drivers? Well, I'll tell you what, I think it won't be long before Oscar Piastri is one of the top 5 drivers, actually. Obviously, it'll be a little bit of time, but I think he has the potential to be not only a Grand Prix winner, but potentially to win a World Championship in the right team, the right car. I think he has the talent. He's really good. So, another impressive drive from Oscar in a car they said wasn't as good as Lando's. Looked to be about 0.3 slower throughout the weekend, and on that basis he would have qualified Q3 for sure, around the Kevin Magnussen mark. And had he qualified there, he could have been a little bit higher than he was, but still a very good drive. I don't think it mattered that much that he qualified where he did, because he still got points and did a good job. So good on him. Very, very good. So I'm going to read some of these out now, just so I can try to get through them as quickly as possible. Evans Nyomo, hey Peter, greetings from Kenya, long time and great to see, waiting for the show, and thanks for always enlightening. Oh, still at the beginning of the show, what a shame. Adam McCarthy, was Adrian Newey's early turbo hybrid Red Bulls as aerodynamically sound as the RB19? Yes, they were. Obviously the aerodynamic rules were completely different then, and they were looking for different solutions, and the high nose was the thing and all sorts of stuff. So, but Adrian's absolutely on the case now as he was then, no problem. Damyan Yul says, bring back the V8s, V10s and V12s. Well, better luck than I have convincing the FIA of that. Again, Evans Nyomo, greetings from Kenya. Seen that. What do I think of Liam Lawson? There's a lot of people asking about Liam Lawson, Nenad DC. Yeah, I think Liam's brilliant. And I think, Red Bull have got some thinking to do there for sure. Sir Windsor, not me, obviously. This is Natella Bra. What are your thoughts on Tsunoda v Lawson at AlphaTauri? Yep, I think that'd be a good team to keep. But as I said before, I think if it's not going to be, if Tsunoda's staying, I would put Liam in the car rather than Daniel, and put Daniel back as reserve driver at Red Bull. Not a great thing from his point of view, but he did leave the team. Life was in his control. Moss GTR says Piastri's just signed a contract extension through to 2026 with Red Bull, I guess. Good on him. Milan Haya. And good on everybody who's been behind him in New Zealand as well. Hildebrand, I think. Hildebrand, something, a name like that. It's done a really good bloke, really good guys, put a lot of money into young New Zealanders, and to see this happening is just great. Shaq Marriott, who has shorter corners, Max Verstappen or Michael Schumacher, and who would you take just on driving ability? Also, Piastri just signed. Okay, so, and did you watch the Freca? I did watch the Freca race, and I saw. Who did I see? I watched the second race from Austria, and I'm going to tell you what I saw. I saw Alessandro Giusti on his 18th birthday from France drive really well to win that race. And the much vaunted Andrea Kimi Antonelli, who was up to P2 at the start, sort of finished a rather desultory P4, making P Windsor think, what's all the fuss about? But anyway, that was sure just one race, doesn't mean much, I know. But yeah, I did watch it. Very impressed by the whole ability to watch that on YouTube live stream. Very good. Why don't they have that for all sports? Any category. Should be de rigueur now. Everything should be free on YouTube. Mega. Yeah, right. That'll happen. Where are we? Talk about this, Peter. Daniel McClay. Yeah, well, I think I have. Diego Marino, another buddy of mine. Hi, mate. Hope the jet lag isn't that bad. Can we compare Carlos's victory in Singapore to that of Gilles Tarama in 81? When Gilles was in the turbo Ferrari dog and just held everybody up because they couldn't get past because he had the turbo engine, so he just blasted it down the straights and then heaved it around the corners to stop everybody. No, I thought that I think Gilles drove well that day. I'm not one of the people that go on and on about that was one of his greatest drives, because it was to me that was just doing what turbo drivers of that era did, which is quite annoying, just holding up all the quick guys like Carlos Reutemann. I'm only joking. No, but you know where I'm coming from. With massive power disparity, then the turbo holding up all those the Matra. Lafitte Matra V12 and then the Cosworth DFV. So no comparison at all. I think what Carlos was doing was just driving at the slowest possible speed because nobody had an idea that deep into the race how the tyres were going to go and what the track was going to evolve to, safety cars, everything else. So he was just trying to drive at the slowest possible speed and keep the car on one piece of fuel, brakes, fuel, and that's what he did, and he did it really well. So thank you for that question. Milan Haya, Piastri is the best rookie I've seen since I started watching in 2019. Wow, good. Yeah, I'd probably go along with that, I think. Let me think about other rookies. That was presumably before Max, wasn't it? But yeah, no, he is very good. He's very good. And this is probably when I was talking about a young driver and not having enough time to do interviews, and I was saying, can you imagine Ayrton Senna not doing that when he was in Ford 2000? And Roderick says, I think that in the Ayrton Senna de Silva era, it was a sport, but now it's a job. Yeah, you say that, and we all like to think that's true, but it's not really, is it? Because most of those young guys racing would still do it if there was no end game and there was they couldn't make any money at it. They do it because they love it. And I think it's almost the same with Max now. He loves his racing. That's why he drove as well as he did in Singapore, because he loves racing, loves Formula One. It was still the Singapore Grand Prix, and he still got the most from the car. And I think they do all love it. So there's no excuse, I think, for... Mr. 51 actually says all these new drivers are crybabies. What do you mean the new drivers? All the old ones are as well, aren't they? Oh, no, it shouldn't be saying that. Damien Ull says it would be very nice if Aston Martin replaced Stroll. But you mean Stroll replaces Stroll, is what you mean. I don't think that's going to happen. Aston Martin is Stroll. He owns the team and branded it with Aston Martin, but it only exists because his son's racing. That's why he's got that team. Thoughts on Antonelli? Well, yeah, just give him my thoughts. P4, race 2, Austria, please advise. Not very good. Only joking. Ayrton Senna 89 is what this gentleman's called. Peter, what are your thoughts on Red 5 selling his entire motorsport collection? Seems very sad to me. Well, I don't know. Well, let me think about that. Red 5 selling all his motorsport stuff. I think, Nigel was never really... He never looked back at stuff, ever. He's a classic, always looking ahead, always worrying about the next shot, the next race, the next whatever. And I thought there's been a long time when Nigel's probably enjoyed having all that stuff in cabinets and everything, but I don't think he'll miss it, to be honest. He's not a sentimentalist. He's just a action man that wants to get on with everything. So I don't think it's sad. Depends where it goes, of course, I suppose. But fair enough. I might sell my stuff soon. I've got much more stuff than Nigel. Yeah, right. I've got a lot of books. A lot of memorabilia. As I stare over in the corner at Troy Ruttman's race boots that he wore in the 58 French Grand Prix when he drove a Chentras Hood Maserati 250F, won the 52 Indy 500 in those same race boots. Or if I look at a pair of Jim Clark driving gloves there, or the Nigel Mansell visor from Monza, or the trophy from Imola, or the Aston DBR1 that Sterling gave me. Are you in Japan? Henry Williams says, you in Japan this weekend? No, I'm not. I'm back in Spain. I'm glad I'm not, actually, because travel is such a pain, really, isn't it? I mean, obviously I was lucky. I'm very fortunate I can travel in luxury, if that's the right word, but there's too much of it for me. And it was a shame that after Singapore, everyone was immediately thinking of Japan because it was such a great race. It would have been nice if people had been able to hang around for a day or two and let it all sink in. And then Japan was 2 weeks later. But no, everything's rush. Wow, here's the thing. I'm going to put this question up. This is quite a radical comment. Wow, I never thought anybody would write this. Let me have a look at this. We're well into extra time here, aren't we? And I have got this thing, the meeting's coming up at 3, so I might just do this a little bit longer. 3 CET, Central European Time, which is half an hour. It says, this is from Ari Match. George is not Formula One material. He's Mr. Saturday, but no world champion. Prove me wrong. Binned it in the Williams behind the safety car, wet at Imola, crashed into Bottas in the Williams and made big mistake in the last race with Lewis. Well, I kind of touched on those and mentioned them, and that is the way he drives. And, the point is, this should also be seen in the context of Lewis saying to Toto endlessly, keep Valtteri. He's exactly the right guy. Keep Valtteri. No, we've got to have the next generation. George is the next generation, the quicker. I blame a lot of the press for that because a lot of them were saying, Valtteri's not quick enough, George is quicker. And, of course, then he won that race. And it's all... I just come back to my thing. If you've got Lewis, you don't actually need George. If you've got George, you don't need Lewis. It's an imbalanced team. Always has been, always will be. And that is the problem with it. If you've got Max, you don't need George in the other car. You need a Perez. And that's why Red Bull is so good. One of the reasons they're so good. You don't necessarily need anybody better than Perez because Max is there. And it's the same, if you've got Lewis, you don't need a George. You need a Valtteri. And that's the problem. That's why everybody's now saying that. But I think it's unfair to say that George isn't Formula One material or isn't a potential world champion. Of course he is. But he's a very different driver to Lewis. He's very, very quick. Blues Almighty. Let's have a look what this is all about. Trying my question again. I'm not sure I've seen this question before, so it's probably just one I never got through to. Trying my question again. Why is flexible aero not allowed? It makes so much sense aerodynamically. Well, of course, it is allowed. It's the question of what they do with the margin. At the moment, it's like 2 millimeters for the floor and various other key aspects of the floor. And, of course, a certain amount of flexibility, again defined by the regulations, is allowed in the front and rear wings in the same way that wings on an aircraft flex. The point is what the Formula One engineers do with that amount of flexion and whether or not they do anything illegal with it. And they allow things to move more dynamically than can be measured statically in the Parc Fermé. That is the point. And nobody's ever said everything should be rigid. Of course not. But some teams have been, and in the past certainly did, allow things to move a lot. It's amazing when you think about the evolution of wings and the first wing that really appeared in any sort of function was the Chaparral wing in 1967 on the 2F Chaparral in sports car racing. And they literally could run that either in horizontal or high pitch angle. Think about that now, how quick a Formula One car would be if you could actually do that everywhere, increase the downforce massively on the corners and then flatten it on the straight. Bit different from DRS, isn't it? And so it went on from there. It's kind of evolved from there ever since. And yes, there's been lots of talk over the years about the amount of flexibility that should be allowed, because there's nothing more dangerous than not having flexion on the cars. And that's where we're at the moment. How much flex should be allowed within the regulations of the front and rear wing, and they've found different ways of measuring that. But it's all, ultimately, it's the dynamic state of the wing that is the real issue. D-Dub says, is it possible for Lawson to be at Williams next year alongside Albon with their DTM history? No, and I think they've already announced the Williams drivers, have they not? I think they have. I think Logan Sargent's staying. And anyway, bearing in mind Logan Sargent pays for the drive, and he's American, which doesn't hurt Doralton, and he's done a pretty good job. No reason to replace him after 1 year. And they've got Alex Albon, who's quick, and if the car is a good car next year, Alex Albon will be able to bring that home, and I think Logan Sargent will too. I quite actually rate Logan Sargent. I think he's done a very good job. I wouldn't say he's Liam Lawson standard, but he's pretty good. Andrew Storm, watch Mansell Red 5 documentary. Enjoyable watch. Good. Yeah, produced by the brother of a friend of mine who we've had on this show before. Richard Wiseman's brother did that. Richard, very, very good archivist. Motion footage archivist, Formula One wise, and his brother Jimmy produced that. So good. I'm glad you liked it. Neil Williams, Uri Match. It was one small mistake. Talking about George now, and a brilliant and very strong weekend. Don't jump to conclusions so quickly. Joseph Farugia. Hey Peter, thank you for your work from Singapore. What's your take on the Red Bull debacle? Is it on purpose? No, I think I will go along with what they're saying, which is that it was the perfect storm of not having the ride heights correct as they went into Brazil last year, but they had more time to get it right and didn't. Well, they got it a bit better actually. In fairness, the handling wasn't too bad. By the time the balance and the handling and the grip level wasn't too bad at the end of qualifying, they still had the seamless shift issues, and that sort of coloured the way people were thinking about it. But the actual car wasn't too bad in terms of handling by the end of qualifying, because they, unlike Brazil, which is a sprint weekend where they were locked into this incorrect ride height and they got beaten in the race, they were able to work away at it here. But yeah, I don't think it was anything to do with a new regulation that's suddenly come in. I feel that 90% to be sure to be the case, but let's leave 10% to what happens at Suzuka this weekend. Because if they are slow at Suzuka, by which I mean if they get beaten by Ferrari or Mercedes or McLaren, then we know there's something that's really happened that has affected them. Dennis Mears says, I think Red Bull called it all last year. Singapore was going to be difficult. And don't forget, I said before Singapore that I thought Ferrari would go well because the straights are longer and there's quite a lot of straights there anyway. So, thank you. Peter Windsor. Match replies to the George Russell thing. I'm seeing a trend when it matters. He seems to lose it sometimes. Just not the car feel when on the limit. The likes of Verstappen or Lewis, probably Norris. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Matt Alford. Hi, Peter. Thanks for all your insights. Always look forward to this. Peter, my favourite driver was Gerhard Berger. Can you tell me any experiences you have with Gerhard and what was his driving style? Yeah, Gerhard. I got to know Gerhard really well when he came into Formula One driving the ATS. And I was absolutely blown away by his... And those days you could say bravery, because it did require a lot of bravery, and because it was a dangerous time in Formula One. And he was one of the bravest drivers I ever saw. Pretty long corners, pretty late apex, but very, very good car control. You always sort of stood back. Oh, his Berger's coming, and you always take a step back from the guardrail when that was happening. He was really quick. Good bloke, massive road shunt he had quite early in his career. I think he broke his neck or his back. And I was always struck by how quickly he got back in the car after that. And that basically, in my mind, highlighted him as a very special, not only a special driver, but a special human being, that to do that in this dangerous era in which we live. And then he had other big shunts, as we know. Yeah, good sense of humour, always had a laugh with him. Nice guy, very nice guy. Run the family trucking business in Austria. Yeah, well, he's just a funny bloke. You know, you'd go up to Gerhard, you'd always have a laugh. That's how he was. He was just a really good bloke. And he still is. Good guy. I like Gerhard. Always liked him. Always got on with him. Amazing how far we go back. Bear in mind that ATS was a good car too. It was designed by Gustav Brunner, yellow, and he was the first guy to do that. That car was the first car ever to have a carbon fiber chassis with a female mold system, which meant in effect that the outside of the chassis was shiny and smooth, and you didn't even have to paint it. You could just put a logo on it or a number. They did paint it, but it didn't require body work. That was a massive breakthrough. Whereas McLaren with the John Barnard car, it was a male mold, and it required body work, obviously. And I think, and I asked John about that once, and he said it was because it was easier to modify bodywork than the chassis. Once you'd gone the chassis route with the female mold, you were locked into that forevermore. So it was an interesting time. Nuttall Braha says, it's not the directives, it's just not a track that benefits from the type of setup advantage Red Bull has. Well, yeah, as I tried to clarify that in the video, I don't think it was so much as... I think it's a simple point is there aren't many corners in Singapore that allow Red Bull to be a very, very good racing car, because the corners are sort of 90-degree corners and straights. There's a lot of that. So there aren't any corners like the last corner at Zandvoort, or even the first corner at Zandvoort, or, you know, all those corners at Silverstone. There aren't any long corners. There probably aren't at Saudi Arabia either, actually, if I think about it. Jeddah, or are there? Yeah, there's a couple of places in Jeddah. Yeah, no, there are. I think Singapore probably has the least corners where a very good car with a lot of downforce can really show itself. And then if you multiply that by getting the ride heights wrong and having all this problem with the seamless shift, no wonder they were midfield and did pretty well, actually, given all that. Darius Radu. Hey Peter, you said in your qualifying video that you were live commentating on Saturday. Where can we find your live commentary? Didn't know you do this every now and then. I'd love to hear it. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I was in the Rolex suite doing that. We had about 45 guests there, and I was just doing a one-on-one, not one-on-one, I was just specifically for them. I was doing a live commentary all 3 days, actually, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, with Jackie Stewart coming in with the odd comment whenever I invited him. I hogged the microphone, as you can imagine, most of the time. And so Jackie sat back and had the odd cup of tea. And no, we had a good laugh together. We always do. Brilliant. And I think everybody enjoyed it. As I said, you know, a lot of people didn't know much about Formula One before they came to that Singapore Grand Prix, and they all left, I think, completely in love with the sport. Yeah, a lot of talk about George, a lot of talk about technical directives. Not many people do think it was that it was due to the technical directive. And on about George. Let's try and get on to something different. Yi Kim Chiu. I'm going to put this up. I can't in any way not put this up, I think. I'm going to have to go soon. It's so annoying, isn't it? Not enough time. Not enough days in the week. Not enough weeks in the month. And so it goes on, the Formula One world. So I've got to move this one now. There we go. Yi Kinchu. Hi Peter, we met outside the Red Bull garage on Sunday. Yeah, I do remember it, and thanks for coming up. Very kind words. A question on whether has the Singapore track changes this year made the race more exciting and unpredictable? Yeah, I think it did actually, didn't it? It kind of, I think there's a bit more side-by-side motor racing in the new section, and there was quite a lot of talk, wasn't there, whether that should be DRS'd or not. I know Lewis was quite keen on having DRS there, which was disappointing actually, I thought, because I'm not a fan of DRS, and I think pure racing drivers are probably not fans of DRS, but I can see why he did it, because Mercedes is not very quick in a straight line. They need all the help they can get, so it was just Lewis being the politician, I think. But yeah, no, I think it did help a bit, definitely. And I would Ferrari have won that race? Would they have been on the pole if it had been the older circuit? No, maybe Lando would have been on the pole. Interesting point. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. C. Amazing, the almighty Mercedes has won a whopping one race since the new regs. And I've got a friend, John Vidalich, who emails me every race virtually with yet another terrible stat about Mercedes. Yeah, I know. Absolutely deplorable, really, isn't it? When you think of who they are and the resources they have, and then you see how well the Mercedes customer teams are going around them from time to time, obviously not Aston at the moment, and you think, what are they doing? What are they doing? Well, I'm sure they don't know either. Otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. Ledion Rocky, a question I haven't heard someone ask is Prost or Senna? What's your take on who was the better driver? I've actually done quite a lot of comparisons between those two. I don't know. I mean, obviously they're very different, but I wouldn't. It was George and Lewis, kind of. Prost was. I mean, the biggest difference is that Prost would come out of the throttle sometimes on the straight to save the engine, and Ayrton would put the throttle down even more and bend the throttle to try and get one more rev out of it. I think that was the difference, really. And definitely Prost was a shorter corner driver, and he had lovely inputs, and the car was always beautifully sitting on the road, lovely and square, flat on the road, whereas Ayrton was on the absolute edge, but made very few mistakes. He probably more capable of sitting on a tiny razor-thin edge than any other driver in the history of the sport, I would think. But I obviously did make mistakes because of that. Ayrton would hold his breath in the middle throughout for as long as he could on a qualifying lap to try and heighten his senses. Prost would fall asleep sitting in the car, waiting to go out. Very different people, and very difficult. If you had one or the other, who would you rather race with? Me, I would have gone with Prost, because I think I would have had a happier time with Prost, and I understood him completely. I knew him very well, still do, from Formula 3 days onwards, certainly all the Formula 1 career, and I knew Ayrton very well too, similar time, but there was always a barrier with Ayrton that you could never really break down, because he was Ayrton Senna, and he built up these walls around him. And so if I was a team owner, I would have enjoyed life more probably with Prost, I think. But both of them, as we know from the way it worked out, very, very close overall in terms of a season, A and B, both of them very capable of winning a bunch of world championships. But yeah, what a time. A bit of inter chat here. Either way, big hype for Sainz. McLaren better in longer corners. That makes sense. Lando driving longer corners. Ricciardo was totally shown up. That's no accident. The car philosophy is aimed at longer corners. I'm not sure about this longer corner philosophy. I think Lando has quite long corners, and that is the way he drives. But I think the McLaren has quite a lot of downforce now, which is why it wasn't that good at Monza. And it should be very good around Suzuka. Very good. I can't imagine Lando will be as good into 1 and 1B as Oscar, or possibly into Spoon as good as Oscar, but he'll be really good up the hill, very good through the Degnas, and very good on 130R, the chicane. So Lando will be really quick, I predict it, at Suzuka. It's assuming it's not wet. Not that he wouldn't be quick in the wet either, but obviously it's a different story if it's wet. One thing that's not talked about very much, and I think it's true, is that I don't think Albon would be in the Williams unless it was for George Russell. I think George, when he got finally got the Merc nod, would have said to Doralton, "You got to run Alex Albon. Believe me, this guy's really good." I think Alex probably owes his second part of his second life, if you like, to George. It's unusual, and I think that says a lot about George's character. So, Devon Middleditch says, it's interesting to see Freddie Vasseur's impact on strategy since leading the Ferrari team. Yeah, I think this was I think Monza, since the car's been going quite well, he's definitely been a bit stronger in terms of where to take the team and how to run the race well. And I don't think it's that he's favouring Sainz. I think if Charles had been in Sainz's car and vice versa at Singapore, he would have said the same thing. And he did the right thing. Keep the guy away from him. And that's why Red Bull are always as good as they are, because it's not often that Perez is in a position to annoy Max these days. Hasn't been. I mean, maybe George hit the wall first, not the curb. Yeah, well, same thing. And it was going in, going into the corner, wasn't it? And it comes under the heading of that longer corner as well. And he's right on the edge. What a mistake. George and Checo always burn new tyres on the first laps. Lewis and Max always go easy for 4 or 5 laps. Yeah, I'm sure it's not as simple as that, but I see where you're coming from. A lot of chat between about Russell and Hamilton now. No, I don't quite sure. Let me read this. I haven't got time. I'm going to have to go soon. I'll read it out. I've noticed, Peter, this is from Hajili. I've noticed that you often link Verstappen's performance to Newey or Leclerc's to Vasseur, but not as much with other drivers, Sainz, Hamilton, Norris, and their team principals, chief technical officers. Is there a reason for this? Well, I don't relate Leclerc's performance to Vasseur as such. I relate his performance to not having a very good car until recently, which is the technical department at Ferrari. Well, the reason I think is that there's only one Adrian Newey, and he's so much better than all of the other Formula One technical departments put together that if you don't relate Max's performance to Adrian Newey's talent, you're completely missing the point. Not in any way detracting from Max, but an absolute 50-50 partner in everything Max has achieved is indeed Adrian Newey. That doesn't necessarily happen in other teams because they don't have Adrian. He's that good. That's why it's that way. It's a bit of a funny question, I think, but I hope that kind of explains it. Finally, someone has said it. Lance Stroll, it's only daddy's money keeping you in Formula One. But I think everybody knows that, don't they? I think they do. I'm amazed they don't, if they don't. I mean, I suppose anybody that says they should get rid of Stroll and run somebody else doesn't know anything about that team, which is a bit odd. What's your take on Prime Kubica? I think you mean Robert Kubica as a racing driver? Yeah, enormous respect for Robert. Obviously pre-accident, different driver, but for him to come back and do what he's done, amazing. Loves the sport, and don't forget, before that accident, he was the driver that Lewis always said was the one he fears the most, and he was that good. He was really good. Very sad. And when he was rallying what was it? Was it a Skoda? I think something like that. And hit a guardrail, and that was that. Terrible. Saying I was 100%, this is Jalen Music official, I was 100% right, saying Mercedes should have just ordered Russell to stay as number 2 and drive for Lewis to retain the title. Yeah, I mean, you can't, if you're Lewis, you don't need George in the other car, simple as that. He's too quick. He's going to in the same way. And I've said it. I think Piastri is too good. If you got Lando, you don't need Piastri. They would have been better off actually keeping Daniel. That's where Daniel should be, alongside Lando at McLaren, and Piastri should be at Renault, Alpine, learning his trade and doing well, and then signing a Ferrari or Mercedes or whatever contract on the basis that he is that good. He's always going to make it. It's a question of, that whole weird thing of walking away from a team that had just announced him as a race driver. This is a hypothetical question from Musa Nguni, but Peter, do you think the racing world would still be as tight if we went back to the last regulation cars? Yeah, I think it'd be tighter. You're talking pre-21, I guess, and I think the racing would be much tighter if we hadn't gone to this ground effect era, because only Adrian really has got on top of it on the basis of knowing how to operate it from circuit to circuit, condition to condition, year to year, and regulation change to regulation change. Only he's managed to do it consistently, and that's never been the case in Formula One. I don't ever remember a time in Formula One where only one team has managed to get the aerodynamics spot on, ever. So yeah, except for Singapore. Okay, I'm going to have to make this the last question. Sorry, Neil Williams. This is a reply. So maybe Lewis doesn't want that. He said he wants to fight the best of the best, unshackled, and he claimed he's never asked for clauses in his teammates' contracts. No, he's just asked for a different teammate. It's quite clear Lewis wanted to keep Valtteri. Of course, once he's got a driver, the last thing Lewis is ever going to do is say, tell this guy to stay behind me. Lewis would never do that. Can Red Bull perform as usual in Japan? They sure can, I think. There's a bit of an I think in there. Do you think, this is Evans Nyomo, do you think Merc will have a competitive car in 24? Probably not. Not to match Red Bull. Hope so. Peter, can you speak to Logan's performance and results? I've just done that, but I think he's done a very good job. Very good job. I rate Logan. It's to my shame and disappointment. There's about 5 occasions when I tried to arrange to talk to Logan when he was in Formula Renault, and then after that, moving up. And every time, it was no problem at all. Yeah, we'll do this. And then I had to call off, or he had to call off, and it never actually happened. So I'm annoyed now, because now he's a Formula One driver. Probably it's much more, his time's much more difficult to get. But anyway, he's a good bloke, I think, and a very good driver. I rate him very highly. So anyway, I think we're near the bottom now. Thank you very much. Another donation there from Jelena Music Official. Thank you very much. Wow. A lot of questions I never got to. I think I got to this one. Yeah, got to that one. Let's have a look. Maybe there's any go. By that, yeah. What are the last questions all about? Up in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, please call out the job. Liam Lawson doing good on him. Thanks, Peter. That's from Roger Holguin. Hi, Roger. Paul Phillipson says, is Honda Power still the class of the field? They seem slow top speed down straight. No, I mean, it's a Red Bull powertrain, let's face it, with a bit of Honda input. Much more Red Bull and Honda now, and it's the same deal they'll have with Ford. Ford will have some input, but not a massive amount. And all credit to Red Bull that they've done all that, and that Dietrich Mateschitz, one of the last things he did before he passed away was to sign off the check for that whole Red Bull powertrain development, which is brilliant. I think the Mercedes factory cars are aerodynamically quite slow in a straight line. So, and McLaren seem to have trouble getting the downforce out of the car when they want to. But I think the Aston and the Ferrari and the Honda are pretty much on a par if you could take away all the aero stuff. The Renault's the one that's probably a bit down on power. But yeah, there's not much difference between those engines because the regulations are so, tight. So there we are. Predictions this weekend? Nah. I'd predict would be Red Bull will be back where they should be. Leclerc will probably go very well against Sainz, but Sainz will be good still. Lewis will beat George over the race. What else? Who have we got? And Max will beat Perez, I would have thought, in equal circumstances. Who else will go well? Oh, I think Gasly will have another good race. He's always good. He's very good at Suzuka, and it's where he went, didn't he, when he went to Japanese Formula thing. He's very good around there. Anyway, sorry for everybody. I haven't got through all the questions, but thank you very much indeed for being a part of this. It's been brilliant. I've got 4 minutes before I have to do the Zoom call now on the exhibition. I've got to go. Thank you so much. Thanks to Jetcraft. Thanks to Pitbox.io, support of this channel, without whom none of this would be possible. Please read on the links on the normal videos I do, and I think on this one as well. I know you're going to probably not in the market to buy a jet tomorrow, but if you know people who are, or indeed you understand that world, you'll know that the companies like NetJets and Wheels Up, where do they buy their aircraft? From our friends at Jetcraft. So brilliant. Thank you very much. Look forward to Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The early starts, won't they, from Suzuka? We'll see what happens then. Thank you.